The rain in Chicago didn't just fall, it assaulted the city. It hammered against the windshield of the Ford E-Series ambulance like a fist, washing the neon glow of the streetlights into a smeared, bloody canvas of reds and oranges. Behind the wheel, Victoria Hayes blinked against the glare, her knuckles white around the steering wheel. She was running on 3 hours of sleep, 2 cups of gas station coffee that tasted like burnt battery acid, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion only a single mother could truly understand. Victoria adjusted the rearview mirror, but her eyes didn't seek the traffic behind her. Instead, her gaze softened as it landed on the dim, cramped back of the ambulance. Curled up on the secondary jump seat, wrapped tightly in a faded U.S. Army surplus blanket, was Daniel. He was 7 years old, his chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm of deep sleep, his small hands clutching a worn-out action figure. Taking your kid on a graveyard shift for a private, low-budget EMS transport company was a fireable offense. Victoria knew that, but when Mrs. Higgins, her elderly babysitter, had been rushed to the hospital with chest pains at 9 p.m., and Victoria's rent was already 2 weeks past due, the universe hadn't left her with a multiple-choice question. It was either bring Daniel, or lose the apartment. Just 2 more hours, Victoria thought, letting out a long, ragged exhale. 2 more hours, buddy, and we're going home to make pancakes. She shifted in her seat, the stiff fabric of her uniform scratching against her collarbone. The rhythmic thump-thump of the windshield wipers usually lulled her into a state of zen. But tonight, the city felt restless. The air pressure was too heavy. It reminded her of the suffocating, electrified air right before a mortar strike in Kandahar. Victoria swallowed hard, pushing the memory down. She was a combat medic once, Staff Sergeant Hayes, 101st Airborne. She had patched up blown-off limbs under heavy enemy fire, breathed life back into soldiers who were halfway to the other side. She had survived a war. Now, she was just trying to survive the American economy. The radio crackled on the dashboard, spitting out static. She reached over to turn down the volume so it wouldn't wake Daniel. She was currently out of service, navigating the desolate industrial district of the South Side to avoid the flooded main arteries. There were no other cars on the road, just towering, abandoned brick warehouses, broken street lamps, and the relentless, driving rain. Then, the shadows moved. It happened with the sudden, violent speed of a nightmare. A massive, matte black SUV tore out from a blind alley to her right, hydroplaning across the slick asphalt. Victoria's combat instincts, dormant but never dead, flared instantly. She slammed on the brakes. The heavy ambulance skidded, tires screaming against the wet road. The massive vehicle violently bucking before slamming to a halt just inches from the SUV's side panel. In the back, Daniel let out a soft yelp as he was jostled awake. "Mom?" his sleepy voice called out, laced with sudden fear. "Stay down, Dan, don't move," Victoria barked, her voice dropping into the sharp, absolute command of a drill sergeant. Before she could reach for the radio to call dispatch, a second black SUV materialized in her rearview mirror, boxing her in completely. The trap was sprung. The doors of the lead SUV flew open. Through the torrential downpour, Victoria saw 4 men step out. They weren't street thugs. They moved with terrifying, tactical precision. They wore dark tactical gear, faces obscured by neoprene balaclavas, and the unmistakable, terrifying silhouettes of short-barreled assault rifles rested against their chests. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her hand instinctively dropped to the heavy steel maglite flashlight beside her seat, the only weapon she had. It was useless against guns. But she was a mother, she would die before she let them touch the doors of her rig. One of the men, a towering figure built like a brick wall, marched straight toward the driver's side. He didn't bother knocking. The butt of his rifle smashed into the driver's side window. The tempered glass spider webbed, holding for a fraction of a second before he hit it again, shattering it inward. A barrage of glass shards and freezing rain hit Victoria's face. Before she could react, a gloved hand shot through the broken window, unlocked the door, and wrenched it open. The muzzle of an M4 carbine was jammed brutally under her jaw, forcing her head back against the headrest. The metal was ice cold. "Hands off the wheel. Do exactly as I say, or I paint this cab with your brains," the man growled. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely audible over the storm. His eyes, visible through the slits of his mask, were dead and devoid of any human empathy. "Okay," Victoria said, her voice eerily calm. The panic had vanished, replaced by the icy, hyper-focused clarity she used to feel in the war zone. "Take the rig. The keys are in the ignition. We don't have drugs. Just let me get my son from the back." The man's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He saw the small, terrified face of Daniel peering over the blanket. A cruel, terrifying shift altered the atmosphere. "Change of plans," the gunman said. From the rear of the ambulance, the heavy double doors were violently yanked open. The wind howled through the cabin, accompanied by a heavy, wet thud on the gurney. Two other armed men had just thrown a body onto the stretcher. Victoria turned her head as much as the rifle barrel under her chin allowed. The man on the gurney was in his late 50s, wearing a bespoke Italian suit that was currently soaked in a horrifying amount of blood. His face was ghostly pale, his breathing shallow and rapid, a classic sign of hypovolemic shock. He had taken multiple rounds to the abdomen. The smell of copper and perforated intestines filled the cramped space of the ambulance, overpowering the scent of the rain. "That's our boss," the man with the gun under Victoria's chin stated. He leaned in closer, bringing the scent of cordite and wet wool into her personal space. "His name doesn't matter. What matters is that he's bleeding out. And the cops have every trauma center in a 20-mile radius locked down. He needs a surgeon," Victoria said, slipping effortlessly into triage mode despite the gun. "He's got a GSW to the gut. If he doesn't get to an OR, he'll be dead in 30 minutes. He's not going to an OR. And he's not dying tonight." The man sneered, "Because you're going to keep him alive. And you're going to drive us where we tell you to go." "I'm a medic, not a magician. I need." The man withdrew the rifle from Victoria's jaw, only to seamlessly point it through the divider, aiming the laser sight directly at the chest of her 7-year-old son. The red dot hovered right over Daniel's beating heart. The breath was knocked out of Victoria's lungs as if she had been physically struck. The world stopped spinning. The sound of the rain faded into a deafening silence. "Mommy," Daniel whimpered, tears spilling down his cheeks, his small body trembling violently under the military blanket. "Look at me," the gunman commanded, snapping Victoria's attention back to his lifeless eyes. "You're going to patch him up. You're going to put this rig in drive. And you are going to get us out of the city. No sirens, no lights, no sudden stops. You so much as look at a cop car the wrong way. And I put a hollow point through your kid's chest. Do we have an understanding?" Victoria looked at the bleeding mob boss. Then at the heavily armed men piling into the back of her ambulance. Their boots muddying the pristine floor. Finally, her eyes met Daniel's. She saw his absolute terror. But she also saw his complete trust in her. He believed his mother could fix anything. He believed his mother could protect him. The veteran inside Victoria Hayes didn't just wake up, she took the wheel. The exhaustion melted away, replaced by a dark, lethal adrenaline. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They saw a desperate civilian. An easy target driving a getaway vehicle. They didn't see the soldier who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and spat in its face. She wasn't going to just drive. She was going to wait for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, she was going to kill every single one of them. "Buckle up, Daniel," Victoria said, her voice remarkably steady, carrying a tone her son had never heard before. She turned back to the gunman, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire. She shifted the ambulance into drive. "Tell me where to go." The Ford E-Series ambulance plowed through the flooded streets of Chicago like a ghost ship navigating a black ocean. The rain was relentless, a torrential sheet of water that reduced visibility to a few dozen feet. Inside the cab, the silence was thicker than the humidity, punctuated only by the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers and the wet, ragged breathing coming from the back. The lead gunman, the one who had smashed her window, was now sitting in the passenger seat. He had holstered his M4 carbine, but a matte black Glock 19 rested casually on his thigh, his finger floating dangerously close to the trigger guard. He smelled of wet nylon, cheap aftershave, and cold sweat. In the back, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. "He's crashing," one of the goons yelled from the patient compartment. His voice was laced with a panic that professional killers rarely showed. "Boss, hey, stay with us. He's bleeding through the towels." Victoria's eyes darted to the rearview mirror. Daniel was still huddled in his seat, his knees pulled up to his chest. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto his mother. He was being so brave, so incredibly quiet, just like she had taught him when the fireworks on the 4th of July sounded too much like incoming fire. "I need to pull over if you want him to live," Victoria said, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. She kept her eyes on the slick road, fighting the steering wheel as the heavy vehicle hit a massive puddle. "Keep driving," the man in the passenger seat barked, lifting the Glock an inch. "I told you, no stopping. Listen to me, you son of a bitch," Victoria snapped, the drill sergeant returning to her voice. The sudden authority momentarily stunned the gunman. "He's bleeding out from a perforated artery. If I don't pack that wound, his heart stops pumping blood and starts pumping air. He's got 10 minutes, maybe less. Now, unless you have a medical degree under that ski mask, you're going to be my hands." The gunman glared at her, the dark slits of his balaclava narrowing. He looked back at the boss, who was now deathly pale, his lips turning a faint shade of blue. "Do it," the leader growled to the bulky man in the back. "Do whatever she says. Open the orange jump kit on the left wall," Victoria commanded, not missing a beat. She took a sharp left turn, the tires squealing against the asphalt. "Top compartment. Find the green package that says, Quick Clot Combat Gauze. And put on some damn gloves. Unless you want to give him sepsis before he bleeds to death." Through the mirror, Victoria watched the bulky thug fumble with the latch of the medical kit. His hands were shaking. These men were used to taking lives, not saving them. Got it, the thug grunted, tearing the package open with his teeth. Now, pull the towels off. Find the exact source of the bleeding. It's going to look like a lot of dark blood. Maybe pulsating. You need to take that gauze and shove it directly into the bullet hole. Shove it in? The thug recoiled. Pack the wound cavity, Victoria yelled, swerving to avoid a downed branch in the road. Push it deep into the tissue until you can't fit anymore. Then press down with both hands using your entire body weight. Do it now. A guttural, agonizing scream erupted from the boss as the thug forced the chemically treated gauze into his abdomen. Daniel whimpered in the corner, covering his ears. Victoria's heart ached for her son, but she couldn't afford to comfort him right now. If she showed weakness, if she lost control of the situation, they were both dead. Keep the pressure on. Don't let up for at least 3 minutes, Victoria instructed, her eyes scanning the dark horizon. They were approaching the intersection of 47th and Halsted. The traffic lights were out, likely knocked offline by the storm. As Victoria eased off the gas to navigate the dark crossing, a sudden burst of red and blue lights illuminated the rain-slicked buildings ahead. A Chicago Police Department cruiser was idling diagonally across the intersection, blocking the eastbound lane. An officer in a bright yellow rain slicker was setting up road flares, redirecting the sparse late-night traffic away from a flooded underpass. The temperature in the ambulance dropped to absolute zero. The leader in the passenger seat instantly racked the slide of his Glock. Chambering around, in the back, the third gunman grabbed Daniel by the collar, dragging the small boy out of his seat and pressing a suppressed pistol directly against Daniel's temple. Not a sound. Kid, the man hissed. Don't you touch him, Victoria roared, a feral, maternal fury exploding in her chest. She slammed her foot on the brake a little too hard, making the ambulance lurch. Drive normal, the leader warned, pointing his Glock directly at Victoria's ribs. You look at that cop. You blink wrong, and your boy's brains are going to paint the floor. You're just a tired medic going back to the depot. Pull forward, slowly. Victoria couldn't breathe. The sight of the gun pressed to Daniel's head made the edges of her vision turn black. The combat veteran inside her screamed to grab the heavy maglite, smash the leader's windpipe, and take his gun, but the math didn't work. Even if she killed the man next to her, the guy in the back would pull the trigger before she could turn around. Stay frosty, Hayes, she told herself, forcing her breathing to slow. You survived the Korengal Valley. You can survive this. She eased her foot off the brake. The ambulance rolled forward at an agonizingly slow pace. The windshield wipers beat back and forth like a metronome counting down to an explosion. As they approached the intersection, the police officer held up a glowing orange traffic wand, signaling for Victoria to stop. He wants us to stop, Victoria whispered, her hands gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles ached. Roll down your window. 2 inches, the leader commanded, pressing himself back against the seat to hide in the shadows of the cab. Get rid of him. Remember what's at stake. Victoria pressed the button. The window slid down, letting in a blast of freezing rain and the roar of the storm. The officer stepped up to the window, shining his heavy flashlight directly into Victoria's face. She squinted, forcing a tired, exasperated look onto her features. Evening, officer, Victoria said, pitching her voice perfectly to sound like a thoroughly exhausted essential worker on a double shift. Roads flooded ahead. "Ma'am," the officer shouted over the rain, his eyes quickly scanning the front cab. "You got a patient in the back?" "No, sir. We're out of service," Victoria lied smoothly, her heart beating so fast she thought it might shatter her ribs. "Just heading back to the garage on 55th. It's been a hell of a night." The officer nodded sympathetically. He lowered the flashlight. "Tell me about it. Take a right here. Cut through the industrial park. Stay safe out there." "You too, officer." Victoria rolled the window up. She didn't look at the cop again. She smoothly turned the steering wheel, guiding the heavy rig away from the police cruiser and into the suffocating darkness of the industrial park. The moment the police lights faded from the rearview mirror, the collective breath of the men in the ambulance was released. The gunman in the back shoved Daniel away. The boy scrambled back to his corner, burying his face in his hands, silently crying. "Smart girl," the leader said, a cruel smirk playing on his lips behind the mask. He lowered the Glock but didn't holster it. "You might just survive the night." Victoria stared straight ahead at the endless, rain-swept road. Her expression was utterly blank. But beneath the surface, a cold, calculated rage was hardening into solid steel. "I'm not just going to survive," she thought, her eyes tracking the dark shapes of the passing warehouses, searching for a tactical advantage. "I'm going to kill you all." The bleeding stopped. The bulky thug called out from the back, sounding out of breath. "Boss is still out, but his pulse is stronger." "Good," the leader said. He turned to Victoria and pointed to a dark, unlit road branching off to the left, leading toward the abandoned shipyards by the river. "Take the next left. Welcome to the team, Doc." The Calumet River shipyards were a graveyard of rusted iron and shattered concrete, swallowed whole by the relentless Chicago storm. Victoria steered the heavy ambulance off the cracked asphalt and onto a gravel path overgrown with dead weeds. The headlights cut through the torrential rain, illuminating towering cranes that loomed in the darkness like skeletal giants. "Kill the headlights," the leader in the passenger seat ordered. He had finally pulled off his soaked balaclava, revealing a face mapped with jagged scars and a pair of dead, pale eyes. "Drive by the running lights. There's a corrugated iron warehouse at the end of this strip. Bay door number 4. Pull right in." Victoria complied in silence. The heavy E-Series rolled forward, its tires crunching over broken glass and discarded shell casings. Beside her, the leader, whose men called him Vance, kept his Glock resting on his knee, his finger tapping a restless, rhythmic beat against the trigger guard. In the back, Daniel was terrifyingly quiet. Victoria's heart ached with every beat. She wanted to pull over, grab her boy, and run into the night. But out here, in this desolate wasteland, a bullet would catch them before they made it 10 yards. Her only option was to play the game until the board flipped in her favor. Bay door number 4 was chained shut, but one of the gunmen from the back hopped out, snapping the rusted padlock with a pair of heavy bolt cutters. With a grinding screech that echoed over the thunder, the heavy metal door rolled up, revealing a cavernous, pitch-black void. Victoria drove the ambulance inside. The moment the vehicle cleared the threshold, the metal door slammed shut behind them, sealing them in a tomb of shadows and echoing rain. "All right, everybody out," Vance barked, stepping out of the cab. The warehouse smelled of stagnant river water, motor oil, and decay. A single, Flickering halogen bulb hung from the ceiling 30 feet above, casting long, monstrous shadows across the concrete floor. Victoria immediately unbuckled her seatbelt and vaulted into the patient compartment. She didn't look at the bleeding boss, she went straight for Daniel. "Mommy," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking as she pulled him into a fierce, desperate embrace. He smelled like damp wool and little boy sweat. "I've got you, Dan, I'm right here." She breathed into his hair, kissing the top of his head. "You are doing so great. You're my brave soldier, remember? I want to go home." He sniffled, burying his face in her neck. "We will. I promise you, we will," Victoria whispered, her eyes hardening as she looked over her son's shoulder. Vance stood at the rear doors of the ambulance, flanked by his two heavy hitters. "Touching family reunion. Now get to work, Doc." He's pale as a ghost and his breathing is shallow. Victoria gently pushed Daniel behind her, shielding him with her body. She turned her attention to the man on the gurney. The quick-clot combat gauze had done its job. The massive arterial bleed had slowed to a sluggish ooze. But the boss was in severe hypovolemic shock. He had lost too much blood. "The bleeding is controlled for now. But his blood pressure is tanking," Victoria stated clinically, slipping on a fresh pair of blue nitrile gloves. "He needs volume. I need to start 2 large-bore IVs and pump him full of normal saline. Or his organs are going to start shutting down in the next 15 minutes. "Then do it," Vance said, crossing his arms, his Glock still gripped tightly in his right hand. "I can't do it with a gun pointed at my kid," Victoria said, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with a dangerous, icy authority. She locked eyes with Vance, refusing to blink. "I need my hands steady. I need to find a collapsed vein in a dying man's arm under a flickering light. If your goon twitches and scares my son, I miss the vein. I miss the vein. Your boss dies. And if he dies, whatever payday you're waiting for dies with him." Vance stared at her, weighing the variables. He was a predator, but he was a pragmatic one. He recognized the cold truth in her eyes. This wasn't a bluff, it was a biological fact. "Russo." Vance snapped his fingers without taking his eyes off Victoria. "Back off the kid. Go secure the perimeter. Make sure nobody followed us." The thug who had held the gun to Daniel's head grunted, holstering his weapon and disappearing into the dark recesses of the warehouse. "Just you, me, and the meathead here," Vance said, gesturing to the bulky thug standing beside the gurney. "Now, fix him." Victoria turned back to the medical bay. Her hands flew over the familiar compartments with practiced, mechanical efficiency, as she ripped open a bag of normal saline and prepped IV tubing. Her mind wasn't just on the medical procedure, it was running a full-scale tactical assessment of her environment. Inventory. Her military training whispered in her ear. She had a fire extinguisher mounted near the side door. Heavy, blunt, filled with vision-obscuring dry chemical powder. She had surgical scalpels in the locked drawer, sharp enough to slice through Kevlar, but requiring close-quarters combat. And then, her eyes landed on the portable defibrillator clamped to the wall monitor. The LifePak 15. It was designed to deliver a massive electrical shock, up to 360 joules, to restart a stopped heart. It was a life-saving device, but in the hands of a desperate combat medic standing on a wet floor, it was a lethal weapon. "Hold his arm straight," Victoria ordered the bulky thug, slapping the boss's forearm to bring a vein to the surface. She uncapped a 14-gauge needle, the thickest one she had. "Careful, bitch," the thug warned, pinning the boss's arm down. Victoria slid the needle into the vein with flawless precision. A flash of dark blood confirming the placement. She connected the IV line, opening the valve to let the life-saving fluid rush into the dying man's system. "One line in. I need another one on his left arm," Victoria said, moving around the cramped space. As she worked, she subtly shifted her footing, angling her body to obscure Vance's line of sight. With her left hand, she reached into the trauma bag and palped a heavy, steel-barreled syringe loaded with epinephrine. She didn't pull it out, just unsnapped the holding strap so it was loose. "Who's coming for him?" Victoria asked, keeping her tone conversational, a classic interrogation technique to keep the target's brain occupied. "You didn't bring him here to die. And you certainly didn't bring him here to wait out the storm. You're waiting for a transport." Vance chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You're smart, Doc. Too smart for a minimum wage gig. Yeah, we got a chopper inbound from over the state line. Private medical evac. They'll be here in exactly 45 minutes. 45 minutes. Victoria mentally started the clock. "And what happens to us when this chopper arrives?" she asked, tying off a tourniquet on the boss's other arm. "You and the kid? You go home." Vance lied. It was a smooth lie, practiced and easy, but Victoria had seen the eyes of men who intended to leave no witnesses. They were the same eyes staring back at her right now. "Right," Victoria said softly. She taped down the second IV line, hanging the plastic fluid bag from the ceiling hook. She wiped her bloody gloves on a towel, taking a slow, deep breath. The boss was stabilized, at least temporarily. She had bought him time. More importantly, she had bought herself time. She looked at the portable defibrillator again, then down at the puddle of rainwater and blood pooling around the bulky thug's boots. The math was starting to align. "He's stable," Victoria announced, stepping back slightly, her hand resting casually on the edge of the counter, mere inches from the heavy steel maglite and the release latch of the life puck. "But he needs his airway monitored. If he vomits, he'll choke on it. You watch him." "Then," Vance said, leaning against the ambulance wall, finally relaxing a fraction of an inch. Mistake number one, Victoria thought, her pulse steadying into a cold, rhythmic drumbeat. She glanced back at Daniel, giving him a microscopic, reassuring nod. Then, she turned her attention fully to the men who had threatened her child. The fear was gone, burned away by a searing, protective rage. The medic had kept them alive. Now, the soldier was going to take them apart. 42 minutes until the extraction chopper arrived. The rain hammered against the corrugated steel roof of the warehouse, a deafening drumroll that drowned out the erratic, wet gasps of the dying mob boss. Inside the cramped patient compartment of the ambulance, the air was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the sour stench of wet tactical gear. Victoria Hayes stood motionless by the cardiac monitor, her eyes tracking the jagged green line of the boss's heart rate. Her right hand rested lightly on the counter, fingertips brushing the cold, knurled aluminum of her heavy maglite flashlight. Her left hand was near the LifePoc 15 defibrillator. She had already unclipped the hard paddles from their holsters. Vance, the leader, was leaning against the bulkhead near the side door. He was relaxed, confident that he had broken the exhausted single mother. He had holstered his Glock, crossing his arms as he watched her. Complacency kills, Victoria thought, the old military adage echoing in her mind. Thank you for being complacent. Hey, meathead, Victoria said, not looking up from the monitor. She addressed the bulky thug who was still standing next to the gurney. His heavy boots planted squarely in a puddle of rainwater and blood that had dripped from the boss's soaked Italian suit. My name's Grissom, the massive man grunted, cracking his knuckles. Watch your mouth, Doc. Whatever, Victoria snapped, injecting just enough panic into her voice to sell the lie. He's aspirating. The blood pressure is dropping too fast. He's going into V-fib. Right on cue, Victoria reached behind the monitor and subtly yanked one of the EKG leads off the boss's chest. The machine immediately shrieked a high-pitched, continuous alarm, the universal sound of a flatline. What the hell did you do? Vance barked, pushing himself off the wall, his hand dropping instinctively toward his holster. His heart stopped. I need to shock him, Victoria yelled over the screaming alarm. She slammed her palm onto the charge button of the life puck. The machine whined, a rising mechanical pitch as it rapidly stored 360 joules of raw, lethal electricity. Grissom, hold his shoulders down. If he convulses, he'll rip the IV lines out, Victoria ordered, her voice cutting through the panic like a whip. Grissom didn't hesitate. He leaned heavily over the gurney, gripping the boss's shoulders with both of his massive, wet hands. His boots shifted, splashing slightly in the conductive puddle of water and blood on the metal floor. Clear, Victoria screamed. But she didn't aim for the boss's chest. In a single, fluid motion born of hundreds of hours of combat drills, Victoria pivoted on her heel. She lunged forward, thrusting both heavy, charged paddles directly into the sides of Grissom's thick, soaking wet neck. She squeezed the apex buttons. Thwack! The sound was sickening, a sharp, meaty pop of displacing air and frying tissue. 360 joules of electricity tore through Grissom's nervous system. The massive man didn't even have time to scream. His eyes rolled back into his skull, every muscle in his body locking in a violent, rigid spasm. The current grounded out through his wet boots into the puddle, magnifying the shock. He crashed backward like a felled oak tree, his skull bouncing off the aluminum floor plates with a hollow thud. He lay there, violently convulsing, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. One down. Vance's eyes went wide. The predator realized he had just been lured into a cage with a monster. He tore the Glock from his holster, bringing the weapon up to bear. But Victoria was already moving. She dropped the paddles, letting them clatter to the floor. As Vance leveled his gun, Victoria grabbed the red fire extinguisher mounted on the wall beside her. She ripped the safety pin out with her teeth and squeezed the trigger, sweeping the heavy nozzle directly at Vance's face. A pressurized, blinding white cloud of monoammonium phosphate powder erupted into the cramped cabin. Vance fired blindly. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. A concussive roar that shattered the overhead fluorescent light. The bullet tore through the roof of the ambulance, missing Victoria by inches. "Mommy!" Daniel screamed from the back corner, pure terror ripping through his small throat. "Stay down, Dan!" Victoria roared back, her voice demonic. Vance was coughing violently, clawing at his burning eyes as the chemical powder choked the oxygen from his lungs. He swung his gun arm wildly through the thick white smoke, trying to find a target. Victoria didn't retreat. She stepped into the smoke, She grabbed the heavy, foot-long mag-light flashlight from the counter. Moving under Vance's wild arc, she swung the solid steel cylinder like a baseball bat. The heavy end of the flashlight connected with Vance's right wrist with a sickening crack. Vance howled in agony, the bones in his forearm shattering instantly. The Glock slipped from his numb fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. Before he could recover, Victoria stepped inside his guard. She grabbed the collar of his tactical vest with her left hand, pulling him off balance, and drove the butt of the mag-light brutally up into his jaw. The impact snapped his head back, dislocating his mandible. Vance's knees buckled. He fell heavily against the sliding side door, gasping for air, blood pouring from his mouth. He looked up at Victoria through the settling chemical dust, his pale eyes no longer filled with cold indifference, but with absolute, primal fear. Victoria stood over him, her chest heaving, the mag-light raised for a lethal downward strike. She looked like an avenging angel bathed in the emergency red glow of the ambulance's backup lights. "You pointed a gun at my son," Victoria whispered, her voice a deadly hiss that carried over the sound of the rain. She brought the mag-light down hard against his temple. Vance's eyes rolled back, and his body went entirely limp, sliding down the door until he was a crumpled heap on the floor. Silence slammed back into the ambulance, broken only by the continuous, shrieking flatline alarm from the disconnected heart monitor and Grissom's wet, raspy breathing as he lay paralyzed on the floor. Victoria stood perfectly still for 3 seconds, letting her combat breathing steady her racing heart. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. She looked down at her hands. They weren't shaking. "Mom?" Victoria snapped out of her trance. She dropped the flashlight, grabbed the EKG lead, and slapped it back onto the boss's chest to silence the deafening alarm. The machine beeped, picking up the dying man's weak, thready pulse once more. She scrambled over the debris and the unconscious bodies, throwing herself into the back corner where Daniel was huddled under the army blanket. His hands clamped over his ears, sobbing uncontrollably. "Dan, look at me, baby," Victoria said, pulling his hands away and framing his small face with her palms. She wiped his tears away with her thumbs, smearing a bit of chemical dust on his cheeks. "Are you hurt? Did anything hit you?" No," Daniel stammered, his entire body vibrating with shock. "I was hiding like you said." "You did perfectly. You are the bravest boy in the whole world," she said, kissing his forehead fiercely. "But we can't stop now. We have to go." Victoria turned back to the wreckage of her ambulance. She stepped over Vance's body and picked up his dropped Glock 19. She checked the magazine, 14 rounds left. She racked the slide, chambering a round, the familiar, satisfying click-clack of the weapon grounding her back in the reality of the war zone. She wasn't just a medic anymore. She was armed. She reached down and stripped Vance of his spare magazines, shoving them into the deep pockets of her M's cargo pants. Suddenly, the radio clipped to Vance's tactical vest crackled to life with a burst of static. "Vance, it's Russo," a gruff voice echoed in the silent cabin. "I heard a pop. Everything good in there? Over." Victoria froze. Russo, the third man, the one who had held the gun to Daniel's head. He was outside in the dark warehouse, patrolling the perimeter, and now he knew something was wrong. 38 minutes until the chopper arrived. Victoria stared at the radio, her grip tightening on the Glock. The trap inside the ambulance had worked flawlessly. But now, she had to step out into the pitch-black warehouse and hunt down a professional killer who was heavily armed and on high alert. "Everything's fine, Russo," Victoria whispered to herself, a cold, predatory smile touching the corners of her lips. Just an adverse reaction to the medication. She turned to her son, her eyes resolute. "Stay right here, Daniel. Do not make a sound until I come back." Victoria hit the release latch on the side door and slid it open. Stepping out into the suffocating darkness of the Devil's waiting room. The hunt was on. Stepping out of the ambulance was like stepping into the belly of a leviathan. The warehouse was a cavern of suffocating blackness. The air thick with the smell of stagnant river water, corroded iron, and ancient dust. The relentless downpour hammering against the corrugated steel roof was deafening. A chaotic symphony that masked the sound of Victoria's steady breathing. She eased the side door of the ambulance shut, leaving it unlatched just enough so the dome light wouldn't engage. She gripped Vance's Glock 19 in both hands, bringing it up to her chest in a tight Weaver stance. Her thumb rested instinctively on the safety, pushing it off with a microscopic click. 37 minutes. Russo was out there somewhere among the skeletal remains of dismantled shipping containers and rusted-out forklifts. He was a professional. He wouldn't come charging out blindly after hearing a gunshot. He would move to cover, assess, and flank. "Vance? Grissom? Talk to me. Damn it." Russo's voice echoed through the massive space, distorted and slightly panicked. Victoria didn't answer. She dropped to a crouch, her heavy M's boots rolling from heel to toe, the classic fox walk she had perfected during night patrols in the Korengal Valley. It distributed her weight evenly, eliminating the crunch of debris underfoot. She moved away from the ambulance, using it as a massive metallic shield. If Russo had night vision, she was already dead, but given the low-budget nature of this local crew, she gambled he was relying on a weapon light. Suddenly, a blinding beam of white light sliced through the darkness, illuminating the dusty air about 50 yards to her right. Russo had activated the surefire light mounted to his suppressed pistol. The beam swept frantically across a stack of wooden pallets, then darted toward the front of the ambulance. "Vance, if this is a joke, I'm going to put a round in your kneecap," Russo yelled, his voice cracking. He was losing his nerve. The silence from his team was tearing at his discipline. Victoria used the sweeping light to memorize the terrain. Between her and Russo was a graveyard of industrial machinery, a massive, rusted lathe, a pile of steel I-beams, and a sprawling network of overhead gantries accessed by a metal catwalk. "Take the high ground," her training whispered, while Russo's flashlight beam searched the ground level near the driver's side of the ambulance. Victoria moved silently toward the steel staircase leading to the catwalk. She climbed the metal grates, placing her feet at the very edges of the steps where the metal was structurally strongest and least likely to creak. By the time she reached the elevated gantry, she was 15 feet in the air, enveloped in total darkness. From here, she had a bird's-eye view of Russo's flashlight beam. He was moving closer to the ambulance now, slicing the pie around the rear bumper. He moved well, keeping his weapon tight to his chest, his light flashing in brief, blinding strobes to disorient any potential targets while preserving his own night vision. "Boss?" Russo called out, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He was 10 feet from the ambulance's rear doors. Victoria needed to pull him away from her son. She couldn't risk a firefight so close to the rig. A stray bullet penetrating the thin aluminum skin of the ambulance could hit Daniel. She reached into the deep cargo pocket of her pants and pulled out a heavy steel D-ring she had unclipped from a tie-down strap in the ambulance. She judged the distance, aiming for a pile of hollow steel pipes resting in the far opposite corner of the warehouse, nearly 40 yards away from the vehicle. She threw the D-ring with all her might. Clang! The heavy metal ring struck the hollow pipes, ringing out like a cracked church bell over the sound of the rain. Russo spun on a dime. His flashlight beam instantly snapped toward the noise, his laser sight dancing wildly across the distant pipes. "Who's there? Show your hands," he screamed, adrenaline taking over his tactical patience. He began advancing quickly toward the noise, moving directly under the catwalk where Victoria was lying flat on her stomach. She tracked his movement, looking down through the steel grating. Her heart was a solid block of ice in her chest. She aligned the tritium night sights of her Glock, the glowing green dots forming a perfect, lethal constellation. But shooting downward through a metal grate was risky. A deflection could send the bullet anywhere. She needed a clear shot. And she needed to strip him of his only advantage, his light. As Russo passed directly beneath her, Victoria reached out and grabbed a loose, heavy iron bolt resting on the catwalk rail. She dropped it straight down. It plummeted 15 feet and struck Russo squarely on the top of his tactical helmet with a sharp crack. "What the?" Russo recoiled, stumbling backward and instinctively shining his weapon light straight up at the ceiling. The blinding beam hit Victoria right in the face. For a fraction of a second, Russo saw her. He saw the exhausted, soaked, blood-splattered medic leaning over the railing, a Glock aimed directly at his face. The shock paralyzed him for a millisecond too long. Victoria didn't hesitate. She squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. Bam! Bam! The deafening roar of the unsuppressed 9mm rounds echoed like cannon fire inside the metal warehouse. The first hollow point round shattered the lens of Russo's weapon light, extinguishing the beam instantly and plunging the warehouse back into absolute, suffocating darkness. The second round caught Russo dead center in his body armor. The kinetic impact of the bullet, hitting with the force of a sledgehammer, lifted him off his feet. He flew backward, his finger convulsing on his own trigger. Peefed, peefed, peefed. 3 suppressed rounds dug harmlessly into the ceiling above Victoria as Russo crashed violently into a stack of empty metal drums, sending them clattering to the concrete floor. Silence slammed back down, heavy and absolute, save for the rain. Victoria didn't move. She kept her gun trained on the darkness where Russo had fallen, holding her breath, listening for the sound of boots scraping on concrete or the rustle of nylon gear. Nothing, only the wet, agonizing groan of a man trying to suck air into bruised lungs. Slowly, methodically, Victoria descended the stairs. She kept her gun raised, navigating by memory through the pitch-black maze of machinery until she reached the scattered drums. She found Russo sprawled on his back. The Kevlar vest had stopped the bullet from penetrating his heart, but the blunt force trauma had cracked his ribs and knocked the wind entirely out of him. He was gasping like a beached fish, his hands weakly pawing at his chest. His suppressed pistol lay 5 feet away. Victoria kicked his gun under a nearby forklift. She knelt beside him, pressing the scorching hot muzzle of her Glock directly against his forehead. Russo froze. his eyes wide with terror in the dim ambient light bleeding through the roof cracks. He looked at the woman holding the gun. She wasn't an ambulance driver. She was the Reaper. The chopper, Victoria whispered, her voice colder than the Chicago rain. Who is on it, and where are they taking him? Go to hell, Russo wheezed, spitting blood. Victoria didn't blink. She shifted her aim down, pressing the muzzle directly against the shattered ribs where her bullet had struck his vest. Russo's eyes bulged. Wait, okay, he gasped, throwing his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. It's a private medevac, hired by the Castellano family. They're landing at the old helipad on the roof. They're just a retrieval team, 2 pilots. 1 doctor. No muscle. Are you lying to me, Russo? She asked softly, pushing the gun a millimeter deeper into his broken ribs. I swear to God, it's an extraction, not a hit squad, he sobbed. Just take the boss. Just let me live, please. Victoria stared down at him. The combat veteran inside her knew that leaving an enemy alive behind her was a fatal mistake. But the mother inside her knew she had already crossed enough lines tonight. She pulled back the gun. Before Russo could exhale in relief, Victoria swung the weapon in a tight, vicious arc, pistol whipping him across the temple. Russo went limp instantly, his head lolling to the side. Victoria stood up, her entire body trembling as the adrenaline began to crash. She checked her watch. 28 minutes. She had taken down the muscle. The warehouse was secure, but her nightmare was far from over. She had a dying mob boss bleeding out in her ambulance, a traumatized 7-year-old son waiting for his mother, and a mafia extraction helicopter inbound. She had to make a choice. Run into the flooded, deadly streets of Chicago on foot with her son, or stay and finish the job she was forced to start. Victoria turned her back on the unconscious hitman and walked back toward the ambulance. It was time to prep the patient for transport. The interior of the ambulance felt like a different universe compared to the echoing, pitch-black tomb of the warehouse. Stepping back into the dim glow of the emergency dome lights, Victoria took a deep, ragged breath, letting the metallic scent of blood and iodine ground her. She engaged the manual lock on the side door and leaned her forehead against the cold safety glass for exactly 2 seconds. Breathe in, breathe out. She was alive. Daniel was alive. The immediate threat was neutralized. Mom? Daniel's voice was a frail, trembling whisper from the back corner. He had pulled the army surplus blanket completely over his head, transforming himself into a tiny, shivering ghost. Victoria holstered the Glock 19 in the waistband of her cargo pants, pulling her uniform shirt over the grip. She didn't want him seeing the weapon. She crossed the cramped cabin, stepping over the unconscious, softly groaning body of Vance, and knelt beside her son. I'm here, buddy. I'm right here, she said softly, pulling the blanket back. Daniel lunged forward, throwing his small arms around her neck and burying his tear-streaked face into her shoulder. Victoria held him fiercely, burying her face in his hair. The terrifying, icy exterior of the combat veteran melted away in an instant, replaced by the overwhelming, desperate love of a mother. Are the bad men gone? Daniel hiccuped, his tiny fingers digging into the tough fabric of her M's shirt. They're taking a nap, sweetheart. They can't hurt us anymore, Victoria whispered, rubbing his back in slow, soothing circles. You were so brave. I am so proud of you. Can we go home now? The question hit her like a physical blow. Victoria looked up, her eyes scanning the wreckage of her mobile clinic. Grissom was still paralyzed on the floor, breathing in wet, ragged gasps. Vance was out cold, his jaw bruised and misshapen. Outside, Russo was incapacitated, but the war wasn't over. If she ran now, the Castellano crime family would find her. They had her license plates. They had her face. They knew she worked for this EMS company. To a syndicate that could afford private, black site medevacs. A single mother on the south side of Chicago was nothing but a loose end to be tied up. There was only one way to ensure Daniel's safety. She had to finish the job. She had to hand the boss over to his people, look them in the eye, and make them understand that Victoria Hayes was not a loose end, she was a steel trap. Not yet, Dan, Victoria said gently, pulling back to look him in the eyes. We have to do one more thing. We have to take the sick man upstairs to his doctors. And then, I promise you, we are going straight home for pancakes. Blueberry ones, with the extra syrup. Daniel sniffled, wiping his nose with the back of his hand. He looked at her with that absolute, unshakable trust that broke her heart and forged her resolve in the same breath. Okay, Mom. A harsh, wet cough dragged Victoria's attention back to the gurney. The mob boss was waking up. The 2 bags of normal saline she had pumped into his veins had done their job, expanding his blood volume just enough to drag him back from the abyss of hypovolemic shock. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing irises as cold and gray as the Chicago skyline. He groaned, his hands instinctively dropping to the heavy dressing packed into his abdomen. He blinked against the harsh overhead light, his gaze slowly coming into focus. He looked at the IV lines taped to his arms. He looked at the floor, where Grissom lay twitching. He looked at the door, where Vance was crumpled in a heap. Finally, his eyes landed on Victoria. Despite the bullet hole in his gut and the fact that he was lying on a blood-soaked stretcher, the man radiated a terrifying aura of power. He didn't panic. He processed the carnage with the clinical detachment of a man who had orchestrated plenty of it himself. "You did this?" His voice was a dry, raspy wheeze, barely louder than the rain hitting the roof. Victoria stood up, stepping between the boss and her son. She crossed her arms, letting her hand rest inches from the concealed Glock. "Your men lacked basic manners. I corrected them." A faint, ghostly smirk touched the corners of the boss's pale lips. "Vance was a blunt instrument. Useful, but stupid. Who are you?" "I'm the only reason you're not in a body bag right now," Victoria stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "Your core temperature is dropping, and your blood pressure is barely holding. You have a chopper arriving on the roof in 22 minutes. I'm going to take you to it." The boss's gray eyes narrowed, calculating the angles. He looked at the shivering boy behind her, then back to the blood spattered across Victoria's face. He recognized a fellow apex predator when he saw one. "Why?" he asked, wincing as a spike of pain shot through his abdomen. "You took out my security detail. You could walk away. Why take me to the roof?" "Because I know how your world works," Victoria said, leaning over the gurney, her face inches from his. "If I leave you here to die, your family hunts me down. If I run, you hunt me down. I have a son. I don't have time to look over my shoulder for the rest of my life." The boss coughed, a wet rattle deep in his chest. "So, you want a deal?" "I don't want a deal. I want a guarantee," Victoria corrected him, her eyes burning with an intense blue fire. "I get you to your doctors. I keep you breathing until that chopper touches down. In exchange, Victoria Hayes and her son cease to exist in your world. No retaliation. No loose ends. We are ghosts." The old man stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The silence in the ambulance stretched, pulled taut over the edge of a knife. Then, slowly, he gave a fractional nod. "My name is Salvatore Castellano," he whispered, extending a trembling, blood-stained hand toward her. "You get me to that roof, ghost, and you have my word. The Castellano family will never look for you." Victoria looked at his hand. She didn't shake it. "Save your strength, Salvatore. You're going to need it for the ride." She turned away from the gurney and moved into action. She unlocked the heavy stretcher from the floor mounts. "Daniel, come here. Stay right by my side. Hold onto my pocket and do not let go." Daniel scrambled out from his corner, his small fingers grabbing a fistful of her cargo pocket. Victoria kicked the side door wide open, stepping back out into the freezing, cavernous warehouse. She grabbed the heavy aluminum rails of the gurney and hauled it backward, dragging Salvatore Castellano out of the ambulance and into the shadows. The stretcher's wheels clattered loudly against the cracked concrete floor. She retrieved Russo's weapon light from the floor where she had shot it. Finding it cracked but still barely functional, emitting a weak, flickering beam, she handed it to Daniel. "You're my point man, Dan. Shine the light straight ahead." "Okay, Mom," Daniel said, his voice steadier now that he had a mission. The weak beam cut a narrow path through the graveyard of rusted machinery. "There has to be a freight elevator," Victoria muttered, pushing the heavy gurney through the darkness. They wouldn't land a medevac on a roof with no way to transport a patient down. Back wall. Near the loading docks. Salvatore gasped from the stretcher, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain of the bumpy ride. Victoria pushed harder, her muscles screaming in protest. The sheer physical exhaustion of a 12-hour shift, compounded by the adrenaline crash of a 3-on-1 firefight, was beginning to set in, but she couldn't stop. The phantom ticking clock in her head was ringing louder with every step. 15 minutes. They reached the back wall of the warehouse. Embedded in the corrugated steel was a massive, heavy-duty industrial freight elevator. Its iron cage was thick with rust, and the control panel was covered in years of grime. Victoria slammed her fist into the heavy green "call" button. Deep within the bowels of the building, heavy gears ground to life with a shrieking, metallic groan. The cables snapped taut, and the massive iron cage began its painfully slow descent. "Mom, listen," Daniel suddenly said, tugging fiercely at her pocket. Victoria froze. She strained her ears over the sound of the rain and the grinding elevator gears. At first, it was just a low, rhythmic vibration, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to vibrate in her teeth. Then, the sound grew louder, heavier, the unmistakable, rhythmic chop-chop-chop of heavy helicopter rotor blades cutting through the stormy air. They were early. The Castellano extraction team wasn't waiting for 45 minutes. They were here now. And Victoria was trapped at the bottom of a dark elevator shaft with a dying mob boss and no leverage until she reached the top. The heavy iron doors of the freight elevator finally clanged open. "Get in," Victoria ordered, shoving the gurney into the rusty cage. She pulled Daniel in behind her and slammed her hand against the roof button. As the elevator lurched upward, dragging them toward the screaming storm and the unknown forces waiting on the roof, Victoria unholstered her Glock. She racked the slide, checking the chamber one last time. The bargain was struck. But the devil always changed the terms. The freight elevator ground its way upward. A rusted iron cage ascending through the dark spine of the warehouse. With every passing second, the rhythmic, deafening thwack 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 of the helicopter rotors grew louder, violently shaking the metal grate beneath their feet. Rainwater poured through the cracks in the ceiling hatch, soaking Victoria and Daniel to the bone. Victoria kept her body positioned squarely in front of her son. In her right hand, Vance's Glock 19 was gripped so tightly her knuckles were translucent. Her left hand rested steadily on the gurney, right next to Salvatore Castellano's shoulder. The mob boss was clinging to consciousness by a thread. The temporary volume from the IV bags was wearing off, and the freezing rain wasn't helping his shock. His shallow breaths puffed into white mist in the frigid air. "Listen to me, Castellano," Victoria shouted over the mechanical screech of the elevator gears. "When those doors open, your boys are going to see a stranger with a gun holding their boss. They are going to have itchy trigger fingers. You need to speak up, or we all die on this roof." Salvatore didn't open his eyes, but a weak, rattling chuckle escaped his pale lips. "You give the orders. I'll give the nod." With a final, bone-jarring clang, the elevator slammed into the roof-locking mechanisms. The heavy corrugated metal doors rattled, jammed for a second, and then slid open to reveal absolute chaos. The storm on the roof was apocalyptic. The wind off the Calumet River, supercharged by the downdraft of the massive Bell 429 Global Ranger helicopter hovering just feet above the landing pad, was a physical wall of force. The chopper was painted matte black, completely unmarked, its twin engines whining with a deafening, high-pitched roar. The moment the elevator doors parted, blinding white spotlights attached to the helicopter's landing skids snapped on, pinning Victoria, Daniel, and the gurney in a harsh, interrogating glare. Victoria squinted against the blinding light and the stinging rain. Her combat instincts immediately processed the threat matrix. There were 4 men waiting on the slick, tar-papered roof. One wore a flight suit and carried a bright orange trauma bag, the medic. The other 3 were built like tanks, wearing heavy plate carriers, tactical headsets, and carrying short-barreled SIG MCX assault rifles. These weren't street thugs like Vance and his crew. These were top-tier private military contractors, mercenaries. And the moment they saw the blood-soaked woman in an EMS uniform pointing a Glock, 3 red laser dots instantly materialized on Victoria's chest. "Drop the weapon. Drop it right now, or I blow your head off," the lead contractor roared over the comms system, his voice booming out of an external loudspeaker on the chopper. "Mommy," Daniel shrieked, burying his face into the back of Victoria's legs, terrified by the sheer volume and the massive, roaring machine in front of them. Victoria didn't drop the gun. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped fully out of the elevator, pushing the gurney into the torrential rain, exposing herself completely while keeping Daniel shielded behind her. She raised her Glock, but she didn't aim it at the heavily armored contractors. She aimed it directly at the unarmored man in the flight suit, the medic. "Hold your fire," Victoria screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice carrying a terrifying, authoritative command that sliced right through the storm. "Your boss is in hypovolemic shock. I've stabilized his airway and packed a massive arterial bleed. But if he doesn't get packed red blood cells in the next 2 minutes, his heart stops. You shoot me, I shoot your doctor. And if your doctor dies, Castellano dies right here on the tarmac. The standoff froze time. The lead contractor, a scarred man with cold, calculating eyes, kept his rifle leveled at her face. He was doing the math. The woman in front of him wasn't shaking. Her stance was perfect. The front sight post of her Glock was dead center on his medic's chest. She wasn't bluffing. She was a professional. "Who the hell are you?" the contractor yelled back, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Where is Vance?" "Vance is asleep on the job," Victoria fired back, slowly pushing the gurney another 2 feet forward. She looked down at the bleeding boss. Salvatore. Now. It took everything the old man had left. With a grueling, agonizing effort, Salvatore Castellano lifted his right arm. His blood-stained hand waved weakly in the air. A definitive, recognizable gesture to his men. The lead contractor's eyes widened. He saw the IV lines. He saw the professional medical packing on the abdominal wound. And he saw his boss's hand signal. "Stand down, stand down," the lead contractor barked into his headset. Instantly, the 3 red laser dots vanished from Victoria's chest. The mercenaries lowered their rifles. Though they didn't sling them, the tension on the roof remained at a boiling point. "Bring him to the bird. Go, go, go," the contractor yelled, motioning for the medic. The flight medic sprinted across the wet tarmac, slipping slightly before grabbing the front end of the gurney. Victoria holstered her Glock smoothly, immediately switching back to her role as a trauma medic. She grabbed the rear of the stretcher, and together, they sprinted toward the open side door of the roaring helicopter. "What's his status?" the flight medic yelled over the rotors, snapping a pulse oximeter onto Salvatore's finger. "GSW to the lower right quadrant. I packed it with QuickClot and gave him 2 liters of normal saline. Blood pressure was 90 over palp when we started up the elevator. But it's dropping. He needs O-negative blood. Right now." Victoria rattled off the clinical data flawlessly as they locked the gurney into the chopper's deck mounts. The medic looked at her, clearly stunned by her precise, professional triage under such extreme duress. "I got it from here. Good work, Doc." The lead contractor stepped up to the edge of the helicopter door. He looked at the bruised, bloodied woman standing in the freezing rain, her arm firmly wrapped around the small boy clinging to her leg. He reached into his tactical vest. Victoria's hand twitched toward her holster. But the contractor simply pulled out a thick, heavy envelope wrapped in waterproof tape. He tossed it onto the wet tarmac at Victoria's feet. "The boss said you were a ghost," the contractor yelled over the deafening engine noise. "Consider this your relocation fund. Castellano repays his debts." Victoria stared at the envelope. It was thick. Thicker than a year's salary at the private EMS company. But she didn't pick it up. She looked past the contractor, locking eyes with Salvatore Castellano one last time as the medic hooked him up to a blood transfusion line. The old mobster gave her a slow, respectful nod. Victoria nodded back. The deal was honored. "Clear the pad," the contractor shouted, slamming the heavy side door of the helicopter shut. Victoria immediately grabbed Daniel's hand and pulled him back toward the safety of the elevator shaft. They ducked behind the thick iron doors as the helicopter engines spooled up to maximum power. With a concussive roar that rattled the fillings in Victoria's teeth, the matte black chopper lifted off the roof. It banked sharply to the east, its navigation lights blinking into the stormy night. Before disappearing entirely into the black, rain-swept clouds over the river. Suddenly, The roof was completely silent, save for the steady, rhythmic drumming of the rain and the distant wail of a police siren miles away. Victoria collapsed against the cold iron grate of the elevator. The adrenaline that had kept her going for the last 2 hours finally evaporated, leaving her completely and utterly drained. Her knees buckled, and she slid down the metal wall until she was sitting on the wet floor. She looked down at her hands. They were covered in grease, rainwater, and blood, but they were no longer shaking. Daniel crept up beside her, his clothes soaked through, his teeth chattering from the cold. He looked at the heavy, waterproof envelope lying in a puddle on the roof, then looked up at his mother. "Mom?" he whispered, his voice incredibly small. "Are we ghosts now?" Victoria let out a breathless, exhausted laugh that quickly turned into a sob. She pulled Daniel into her lap, wrapping her arms around him so tightly she felt his heart beating perfectly in sync with hers. She rested her chin on the top of his wet head, closing her eyes as the icy rain washed the blood from her face. "No, baby," Victoria whispered into the storm. "We're not ghosts. We're survivors." She kissed his forehead, a fierce, protective seal. "Come on," she said, slowly pushing herself up off the floor and reaching down to pick up the heavy envelope. "Let's go home and make those pancakes." 72 hours later, the rain had stopped, but the chill in Victoria's bones remained. She sat at the cheap, chipped formica table in her cramped South Side apartment, staring at the contents of the waterproof envelope. The midday sun fought its way through the grime-streaked window, casting harsh rays over neatly stacked bundles of currency. $500,000, in crisp, uncirculated $100 bills. It was more money than Victoria had ever seen in her life. It was a ticket out of poverty, a college fund for Daniel, a house with a yard in a neighborhood where gunshots didn't function as an alarm clock. But as she reached out and brushed her fingertips against the paper strap holding the stacks together, she felt violently ill. The money smelled like wet tar, aviation fuel, and copper. It smelled like blood. "Mom?" Victoria flinched, instinctively throwing a dish towel over the stacks of cash. She turned to see Daniel standing in the doorway of the tiny kitchen. He was wearing his oversized Spider-Man pajamas, clutching his battered action figure. There were dark, bruised circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept a full night since the warehouse. Every time a car backfired on the street below, he would dive under his bed, trembling. "Hey, sleepyhead." Victoria forced a bright, reassuring smile, pulling the towel a little tighter over the money. "You hungry? I was just about to make those pancakes I promised. Sorry they're 3 days late." Daniel shuffled into the kitchen, his bare feet padding softly against the worn linoleum. He didn't ask about the towel. He just wrapped his small arms around Victoria's waist and buried his face in her stomach. "I don't want pancakes," he mumbled. "I want to leave. Can we leave now?" Victoria's heart cracked right down the middle. She stroked his messy hair, kissing the top of his head. "I know, buddy. I know. I'm working on it. I just need to figure out the logistics. We have to be smart about this." She couldn't just walk into a bank and deposit $500,000 without triggering a massive alert from the IRS and the Department of Homeland Security. She couldn't buy plane tickets under their real names. Castellano had promised not to hunt her, but the Chicago Police Department hadn't made any such deal. On the tiny, static-filled television sitting on the kitchen counter, the midday local news was murmuring in the background. Suddenly, A familiar image flashed across the screen, making the blood freeze in Victoria's veins. It was an aerial shot of the Calumet River shipyards. Yellow police tape was stretched for miles. Dozens of squad cars, forensic vans, and heavily armed SWAT vehicles surrounded the corrugated iron warehouse. Victoria gently untangled herself from Daniel. "Go grab your backpack. Dan, pack your favorite toys, okay? Just the important ones. Are we going on a trip?" "Yeah, a long one. Go pack." As Daniel scurried off to his room, Victoria reached over and turned up the volume on the TV. The cheerful facade she wore for her son vanished, replaced by the grim, hyper-focused stare of a soldier evaluating an enemy offensive. Authorities are remaining tight-lipped about the gruesome discovery made early yesterday morning at the abandoned shipyard. The perfectly coiffed news anchor reported, her face grave. Sources close to the investigation tell Channel 5 that the scene resembles a war zone. 3 men were found inside, severely injured but alive. Police also discovered an abandoned ambulance belonging to Metrocare EMS, heavily damaged and covered in blood. Victoria gripped the edge of the counter. She had scrubbed the rig as best as she could in the 3 minutes she had before fleeing the roof. But you couldn't erase a bloodbath. They had the rig. They had the company name. The broadcast cut to a live shot of a man standing outside the warehouse. He didn't look like a local beat cop. He wore a sharp, dark suit, a trench coat, and an ID lanyard dangling over his tie. He had the hard, unyielding face of a bloodhound who had just caught a fresh scent. "This is no longer just a local jurisdiction matter," the man in the suit told the flock of reporters, his voice a calm, deep baritone that commanded absolute authority. "I am Special Agent Marcus Thorne with the FBI's Organized Crime Task Force. We are taking point on this investigation. We have reason to believe this incident is tied to a major syndicate. We are currently searching for the driver of the Metrocare ambulance, a civilian who we believe was abducted during her shift. If you are watching this, Miss Hayes, please come forward. We want to help you." Victoria let out a shaky breath. Miss Hayes. They had her name. Agent Thorne's eyes stared directly into the camera lens. He wasn't talking to the public, he was talking directly to her. And beneath the polite, professional offer of help, Victoria heard the underlying threat. They didn't think she was just a victim. A victim wouldn't have left 2 heavily armed cartel enforcers comatose and a 3rd PMC mercenary shot with his own gun. Thorne knew she was dangerous. And he was hunting her. Victoria slammed the power button on the TV, plunging the kitchen into silence. The timeline had just accelerated violently. She didn't have days to plan an exit strategy. She had hours, maybe minutes. She ripped the dish towel off the table and grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag from the closet. She began sweeping the stacks of $100 bills into the bag, not bothering to count them anymore. It was just paper now. Paper that would buy them new identities. She ran into the bedroom. She bypassed the closet entirely and went straight for the loose floorboard under her bed. She pried it up, retrieving a lockbox. Inside was her honorable discharge paperwork from the U.S. Army, Daniel's birth certificate, their social security cards, and her personal, unregistered Sig Sauer P365, a compact 9mm she kept for home defense. She checked the magazine, chambered a round, and slipped it into the small of her back. "Mom, I'm ready," Daniel called out from the living room. He was wearing his yellow raincoat and carrying a small, stuffed backpack. He looked so small, so innocent. He didn't deserve a life on the run. Good job, buddy, Victoria said, throwing the heavy duffel bag over her shoulder. Put your hood up. We're going to play a game. Okay? It's called the invisible game. We have to be super quiet. And we can't let anyone see us. Daniel nodded solemnly. He was getting too good at this game. Victoria grabbed her keys and moved toward the front door of the apartment. She reached for the deadbolt. But her combat instincts, the tiny hairs standing up on the back of her neck, screamed at her to stop. She paused. She pressed her eye against the peephole. The hallway was empty, illuminated by a flickering, dying fluorescent bulb, but the silence felt wrong. It was too heavy. Victoria backed away from the door. She moved to the window overlooking the street. Keeping herself hidden behind the ratty curtain, she peeked out. Parked across the street, illegally blocking a fire hydrant, was a dark gray Ford Taurus. It had blacked-out tinted windows and multiple antennas sprouting from the trunk. As she watched, the driver's side window rolled down a fraction of an inch, and a small plume of cigarette smoke drifted out into the cold Chicago air. Feds. They were already here. They hadn't come with sirens blaring. They had come quietly to set a perimeter. They were waiting for backup. Or waiting for her to make a move. Mom? Daniel whispered, noticing the shift in her posture. Are the bad men outside? Different kind of bad men. Dan, Victoria murmured, her mind racing through a dozen different tactical scenarios. Going out the front door was a death sentence, or a life sentence in federal prison. Which to her, was the exact same thing. Going out the fire escape would put them directly in the line of sight of the Ford Taurus. She looked around the tiny apartment. Her eyes landed on the dry wall separating her bedroom from the adjacent, currently vacant unit. Victoria dropped the duffel bag. She walked into the kitchen and grabbed a heavy steel claw hammer from the utility drawer. Castellano thought she was a ghost. Agent Thorne thought she was a suspect. It was time to show them both that Victoria Hayes was a force of nature. Cover your ears, Daniel, she said, raising the hammer high above her head. We're making our own door. Victoria swung the heavy steel claw hammer with the precision of a wrecking ball. Crack! The dry wall in her bedroom shattered inward, sending a thick, choking cloud of white gypsum dust into the air. She didn't stop. She swung again and again, aiming between the wooden studs she had located by knocking her knuckles against the paint just seconds before. The noise was deafening in the small room, a violent drumming that masked the sound of her own racing heart. Stay back, Dan, cover your mouth, Victoria coughed, pulling the collar of her shirt over her nose. She swung the hammer one last time, breaking the plasterboard on the opposite side. A jagged, ragged hole, roughly 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, now connected her bedroom to Unit 4B, the vacant apartment next door. Okay, baby, go through the hole, right now, Victoria ordered, her voice a sharp, urgent whisper. Daniel didn't hesitate. He clutched his small backpack to his chest and scrambled through the jagged opening, his yellow raincoat getting snagged for a second before he pulled himself free. Victoria grabbed the heavy canvas duffel bag loaded with $500,000 of cartel cash and shoved it through the gap after him. She tossed the hammer onto her bed and dove through the wall just as a massive, world-shattering boom echoed from the front of her apartment. The front door of Unit 4A blew off its hinges. FBI, nobody move. Hands where we can see them. The screaming voices of heavily armed tactical agents flooded Victoria's living room. The heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots shook the floorboards. Flashlights cut through the gloom, their bright beams sweeping frantically across her tiny kitchen and living space. Victoria hit the dust-covered floor of the vacant apartment and instantly rolled to her feet. The air in Unit 4B was stale, smelling of old cigarettes and rotting wood. The blinds were drawn, plunging the room into shadows. She grabbed Daniel's hand and pressed a finger to her lips. Absolute silence. She dragged him away from the shared wall, moving quickly toward the kitchen area of the empty apartment. Behind them, the muffled shouts of the FBI team filtered through the hole she had just made. Clear. Kitchen clear. Bathroom clear. Then, a new voice cut through the tactical chatter. It was deep, calm, and terrifyingly composed. The voice from the television. Special Agent Marcus Thorne. Hold your perimeter, Thorne commanded, his heavy footsteps approaching the bedroom. She didn't fly out the window. The fire escape is covered. Victoria knelt behind a moldy kitchen island in the vacant apartment, pulling Daniel tight against her chest. She unholstered her Sig Sauer P365, her thumb resting on the safety. But her finger stayed strictly off the trigger. She would never fire on federal agents. The gun was only for absolute, desperate leverage if they were cornered by a lone scout. Through the hole in the wall, a blinding white beam from a weapon light suddenly sliced into the dark. Empty apartment, narrowly missing Victoria's shoulder. Son of a bitch, Thorne muttered from the other side. She breached the drywall. She's in 4B. Move. Get the breacher on the door of 4B. Right now. Cover the alleyway. They know. Mom. Daniel whimpered, tears silently streaming down his face, cutting tracks through the white drywall dust coating his cheeks. I know. Baby. We're faster, Victoria whispered fiercely. She hauled the heavy duffel bag over her shoulder. Going out the front door of 4B would lead them right into the hallway where the tactical team was currently setting up a battering ram. Going out the window was suicide. The surveillance car was still out front. But Victoria knew this building. She knew the cheap, corner-cutting architecture of the South Side tenements. She dragged Daniel to the back corner of the vacant apartment. Near the dilapidated bathroom, there was a small, rusted metal door set into the wall, the old incinerator and laundry chute access. Out of commission since the late 90s. Clear the stack, breaching 4B, a muffled voice yelled from the hallway. Boom! The front door of the vacant apartment splintered open. Victoria yanked the rusted handle of the chute door. It groaned loudly, protesting against decades of disuse. Before popping open, the smell of ancient soot and mildew hit her like a physical blow. The shaft was pitch black, dropping straight down 4 stories to the basement boiler room, but there was a heavy iron ladder bolted to the brick interior. Climb, Dan. Don't look down. Just look at my hands, Victoria ordered, lifting him into the dark, cramped shaft. Daniel grabbed the cold iron rungs. His small hands were trembling violently. But he began to descend into the darkness. Flashlight beams swept into the living room of 4B. Heavy boots crunched on the broken drywall. Victoria threw the duffel bag into the chute. It plummeted down, hitting the basement floor seconds later with a muffled, heavy thud. She stepped onto the iron ladder, pulled the small metal door shut behind her, and engaged the rusted latch just as the FBI agents swarmed the bathroom. Total darkness enveloped them. The air was suffocatingly tight, filled with a century of dust. "I'm right above you, Dan, one rung at a time," Victoria whispered, her voice echoing softly in the brick tunnel. They climbed down rapidly, the muffled sounds of the FBI tearing the apartment apart above them fading into a dull roar. Victoria's muscles burned. The adrenaline was pushing her past her physical limits. She had survived a firefight, patched a dying mob boss, negotiated with mercenaries, and was now scaling down a dark chimney shaft with $500,000 while the FBI hunted her. She was officially a fugitive. They hit the basement floor. Victoria found the duffel bag in the darkness and threw it over her shoulder. She grabbed Daniel's hand and navigated through the labyrinth of massive, silent boilers and rusted pipes. She found the heavy steel service door leading out to the back alley. She pressed her ear against the freezing metal. Only the sound of the wind and distant city traffic. The alley was blind to the main street where the Ford Taurus was parked. Thorne hadn't had time to secure the rear perimeter yet. She pushed the crash bar. The door swung open, spitting them out into a narrow, garbage-strewn alleyway. The biting chill of the Chicago afternoon hit them, a welcome relief from the suffocating dust of the building. "Keep your hood up, walk fast, but don't run," Victoria instructed, grabbing Daniel's hand tightly. They power-walked down the alley, putting a block of distance between them and their apartment building within minutes. They emerged onto a busy, bustling avenue, instantly dissolving into the sea of pedestrians, delivery trucks, and the chaotic noise of the city. Victoria stopped in front of a reflection in a pawn shop window. She looked at herself. Her hair was matted with white dust. Her clothes were filthy, and she looked like a woman who had just crawled out of a grave. She looked at Daniel, clutching his backpack, his small face pale and exhausted. They had money. They had escaped the initial net. But they had no car, no secure shelter, and their faces would soon be plastered across every law enforcement database in the Midwest. "Where are we going, Mom?" Daniel asked, his voice lost in the roar of a passing elevated train. Victoria adjusted the strap of the heavy duffel bag, feeling the weight of the Castellano money pressing against her collarbone. She looked down the long, gray avenue stretching out into the heart of America. "We're going to buy a new life, Dan," Victoria said, her eyes hardening into steel. "But first, we need a ride." The biting wind whipping off Lake Michigan was a blessing in disguise. It gave Victoria an excuse to pull her collar up high and keep Daniel's bright yellow hood pulled low over his face. They moved quickly down the crowded sidewalk of Cermak Road, blending into the afternoon rush of delivery drivers, exhausted commuters, and college students. Every time a police cruiser rolled past, its siren wailing in the distance, Victoria felt a phantom bullet graze her spine. She kept her right hand buried deep in her jacket pocket, her fingers resting lightly on the cold grip of the Sig Sauer. "Mom, my legs hurt," Daniel whispered, his small hand gripping hers like a vice. He was dragging his feet. The adrenaline from the apartment raid completely drained from his tiny body. "I know, baby. Just a little further," Victoria said, scanning the street. They ducked into a dingy, 24-hour coin laundromat. The smell of cheap detergent and stale bleach hit them instantly. Victoria ushered Daniel straight into the cramped, graffiti-covered bathroom in the back and locked the flimsy door. "Take off the raincoat, Dan," she instructed, turning on the faucet. The water ran rust brown for a second before turning clear and freezing cold. She grabbed rough paper towels, soaked them, and began furiously scrubbing the white drywall dust from Daniel's face and hair. She washed her own face next, scrubbing until her skin was raw, erasing the ghostly pallor of the plaster. She stripped off her Metrocare M's uniform shirt, shoving it deep into the trash can under a pile of wet paper towels. Underneath, she wore a plain gray thermal Henley. It wasn't warm enough for Chicago in late autumn, but it stripped away her identity. "Look at me," Victoria said, kneeling to Daniel's eye level. He looked exhausted, terrified, but clean. "You're doing so good. We just have to make one stop. And then you can sleep the whole car ride. Deal?" "Deal," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. 10 minutes later, they were walking through the industrial edge of the Pilsen neighborhood. The gentrified coffee shops gave way to chain-link fences, razor wire, and auto body shops that didn't have names on their signs. Victoria stopped in front of a sprawling, grease-stained garage. The massive overhead bays were open, revealing a graveyard of stripped-down muscle cars and imported sedans. The deafening whine of an impact wrench echoed from the back. She walked past a "No trespassing" sign, leading Daniel through the maze of oil slicks and spare parts until they reached a man lying on a creeper under a vintage Chevy Nova. "Shop's closed. Read the sign." A gruff voice echoed from beneath the chassis. "I need a favor, Coop," Victoria said, her voice steady and loud enough to carry over the classic rock blaring from a nearby boombox. The mechanic froze. Slowly, he slid out from under the car, wiping his grease-stained hands on a red shop rag. Elias, Co-op. Cooper was a mountain of a man with a thick, graying beard, arms covered in faded military tattoos, and a slight limp in his left leg. He had been a motor pool sergeant in the 101st Airborne. And Victoria had been the medic who tied the tourniquet on that leg when an IED tore through their convoy outside Kandahar. Co-op stared at her, his eyes darting from her bruised face to the heavy canvas duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and finally down to the shivering little boy clinging to her leg. He didn't smile. He walked over to the boombox and clicked it off. The sudden silence in the garage was deafening. "Come into the office," Co-op muttered, limping toward a glass-enclosed booth at the back of the shop. Victoria followed him inside, pulling the blinds shut the moment they entered. The office smelled of stale coffee, cigar smoke, and motor oil. On a small television mounted in the corner, a local news anchor was talking over a picture of Victoria in her M's uniform. "The FBI is asking the public not to approach Victoria Hayes, considering her armed and highly dangerous." Co-op picked up the remote and muted the TV. He leaned against his cluttered desk, crossing his massive arms. "You're radioactive, Vic," Co-op said, his voice a low rumble. "I owe you my leg. And maybe my life. But the feds? The Organized Crime Task Force? They raid this shop. I go away for 20 years. And my kids go into the system. I'm not asking you to hide me." "Elias," Victoria said, maintaining eye contact, "I'm not asking for a handout. Either. I need a ghost car. Something reliable, invisible, with plates that won't flag a scanner on the interstate. And I need burner phones. Right now." Co-op rubbed his bearded jaw, looking at Daniel, who had curled up on a battered faux leather sofa in the corner and was already fighting to keep his eyes open. "Every camera at every toll booth from here to the state line is going to be running facial recognition by nightfall." Co-op warned her. "They think you're a cartel hitter. Vic, what the hell did you get mixed up in?" I went to work, and the war followed me home. Victoria said coldly. Do you have a car or not? Victoria swung the heavy canvas duffel bag off her shoulder and set it on Coop's desk. She unzipped it just enough to reveal the neatly stacked bundles of uncirculated $100 bills. Coop's eyes widened a fraction of an inch. He had seen drug money before, but $500,000 of cartel cash sitting on his desk hit different. I don't want your money. Vic, Co-op sighed, turning away from the bag. I don't touch syndicate cash. It brings nothing but blood. Then take it out of the "I saved your leg" account. Victoria countered, zipping the bag back up. Just give me the keys. Coop, let me get my son out of this city. Co-op stared at the muted television for a long moment, watching the news ticker scroll Victoria's name across the bottom of the screen. Finally, he reached into the top drawer of his desk and pulled out a ring of keys and 2 cheap, prepaid cell phones in plastic blister packs. Bay 3, Co-op said, tossing the keys to her. Victoria caught them effortlessly. 2014 silver Subaru Outback. Has a slight dent in the rear bumper. Looks exactly like a million other mom mobiles on the road. Engine is completely rebuilt. Tires are new. The plates belong to a similar Subaru sitting at the bottom of a quarry in Indiana. They'll run clean on a casual scan. But don't get pulled over. Thank you, Elias, Victoria said, the tight knot in her chest loosening just a fraction. Don't thank me, and don't ever come back here, Co-op said firmly, though his eyes softened as he looked at her. Stay off the major interstates. Take the state routes. Pay for your gas in cash. Keep the kid out of sight at the pumps. And ditch the car in a month. I know the drill. Victoria nodded. She walked over to the sofa and gently scooped Daniel into her arms. He didn't even wake up, his head rolling onto her shoulder. Dead to the world. She carried her son out of the office and walked over to Bay 3. The silver Subaru sat there. Dull, unassuming, and absolutely perfect. It was the ultimate camouflage. Nobody looked twice at a slightly dented, 10-year-old station wagon. Victoria strapped Daniel into the back seat, covering him with a heavy wool blanket she found in the trunk. She threw the duffel bag full of cash onto the floorboards, hiding it under a pile of fast food wrappers and empty water bottles Co-op had strategically left there to make the car look lived in. She climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine purred to life, a smooth, quiet hum that sounded like pure freedom. As she backed the Subaru out of the garage, Co-op stood by the bay doors. He gave her a crisp, 2-finger salute, a silent acknowledgement from one soldier to another. Victoria nodded back, shifting the car into drive. She navigated the backstreets of Pilsen, merging onto Interstate 55 South just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The sky bruised into shades of purple and dark gray. Victoria glanced in the rearview mirror. The towering, jagged skyline of Chicago, the city that had broken her. The city that had nearly taken her son. The city that was now hunting her, was slowly shrinking into the distance. She was a ghost now. But ghosts still had to look over their shoulders. She pressed her foot down on the gas pedal, steering the silver Subaru into the encroaching darkness of the American Midwest. The real run had just begun. Special Agent Marcus Thorne did not believe in ghosts. He believed in evidence, trajectory, and human error. He stood in the center of Unit 4A, the white gypsum dust from the breached wall settling gently onto the shoulders of his dark wool suit. The apartment was a chaotic mess of overturned furniture and shredded floorboards, swarming with FBI evidence technicians. But Thorne's dark, analytical eyes were fixed entirely on the jagged hole connecting the bedroom to the vacant apartment next door. He stepped closer, running a gloved finger along the broken edge of a wooden stud. "She didn't just smash it blindly," Thorne murmured, his deep baritone cutting through the radio chatter of the room. "Look at the impact points." She tested the wall, found the hollow space between the studs, and struck with maximum kinetic force. Clean, efficient. A younger agent, Miller, stepped into the bedroom holding a clear plastic evidence bag. "Sir, we found this hidden under a loose floorboard in the corner." She emptied a lockbox, but she left the folder behind. "Guess she was in a hurry." Thorne took the bag. Inside was a thick manila folder stamped with the seal of the Department of the Army. He read the top document, his jaw tightening with every line. Victoria Hayes, Staff Sergeant, 101st Airborne Division, Primary MOS, 68W, Combat Medic Specialist. Honorable discharge, 2 tours in Afghanistan. Silver Star recipient for pulling 3 wounded soldiers from a burning Stryker vehicle under heavy enemy fire. Thorne slowly lowered the file. The puzzle pieces violently snapped into place. The 3 incapacitated cartel hitters at the shipyard. The flawlessly executed egress through a brick incinerator chute. The total lack of digital footprint since she fled. "We're not hunting a panicked ambulance driver, Miller," Thorne said, his voice deadly quiet. "We're hunting a highly trained combat veteran who operates flawlessly in high-stress environments. She has a hostage, her own son, which makes her desperate. And she likely has Castellano's payoff money, which makes her funded. We have her plates flagged on every tollway in the state," Miller offered, trying to sound optimistic. "She's not on the tollways," Thorne replied, turning away from the hole in the wall. "She knows our playbook. She'll take the state routes. She'll use burner cars. Contact the state police in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. I want every mom and pop gas station and cash-only motel on the back roads scoured. Pull the security tapes. She's good, but she's traveling with a 7-year-old. She has to stop eventually." 200 miles away, the silver Subaru Outback cut through the pitch-black Indiana night like a silent torpedo. The rain had started again. A slow, freezing drizzle that smeared the windshield. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the wipers was the only sound inside the car. Victoria's hands were locked onto the steering wheel at 10 and 2. Her knuckles aching, her eyes flicked endlessly between the dark, winding asphalt of Route 41 and the rearview mirror. Every set of headlights that appeared behind her caused a spike of adrenaline. She would hold her breath, mentally preparing to swerve, to ram, to fight, only when the car passed, revealing an exhausted trucker or a minivan, would she force herself to exhale. "Mom?" Daniel's voice was a frail whisper from the backseat. Victoria glanced in the mirror. He was sitting up, the heavy wool blanket clutched to his chin. The passing streetlights cast long, moving shadows across his pale face. "I'm here, Dan," Victoria said softly, turning the heater up a notch. "Did you sleep? Every time I close my eyes, I hear the loud noises," Daniel said, his lower lip trembling. "I see the man with the red light on his gun." Victoria's heart shattered. The PTSD wasn't just hers anymore, she had passed it down to her son. The war had touched him. "I know, baby, I know," she whispered, fighting the burn of tears in her own eyes. "But we are safe now. I promise you." She saw a flickering neon sign approaching on the right side of the desolate highway. Starlight Motel. Vacancy. Cash only. It was a rundown, single-story L-shaped building with peeling paint in half the letters burned out on the sign. It was perfect. Victoria pulled the Subaru around to the very back of the motel, parking it in a blind spot behind a rusted dumpster, completely out of sight from the main road. "Stay low. Keep the hood up," she instructed, grabbing the heavy duffel bag of cartel cash. The check-in process was a blur of practiced lies. Victoria kept her head down, handed over $60 in small bills she had found in Coop's glove box, and signed the register as Sarah Connor, a dark joke only she would understand. The exhausted clerk behind the bulletproof glass didn't even look up from his phone. Room 114 smelled intensely of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpet, and cheap pine cleaner, but it had a deadbolt and a chain lock. The moment the heavy wooden door clicked shut, Victoria threw the deadbolt. She latched the chain. She dragged the heavy oak dresser across the carpet, wedging it firmly against the door handle. Then, she moved to the window, pulling the heavy, blackout curtains tightly shut, making sure not a single sliver of light could escape. Only then did she drop the duffel bag. It hit the floor with a heavy, muffled thud. Daniel stood in the center of the dingy room, looking incredibly small. He hadn't taken off his yellow raincoat. He was just staring at the stained floral bedspread, completely hollowed out. Victoria knelt in front of him, unzipping the raincoat. "Hey, look at me, Dan." He met her eyes, and the sheer emptiness in his gaze broke whatever dam was left inside her. "I am so sorry," Victoria whispered, her voice finally cracking. She pulled him into her chest, burying her face in his small shoulder. "I am so sorry I brought you to work. I'm sorry you had to see those things. I'm sorry you have to be so brave." Daniel wrapped his arms around her neck. He didn't cry. He just patted her back, a terrifyingly adult gesture of comfort. "It's okay, Mom. You fixed the bad men. You always fix it." Victoria carried him to the bed, tucking him under the covers fully clothed. She sat beside him, stroking his hair until his breathing finally leveled out into the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep. When she was absolutely sure he was asleep, Victoria stood up. She walked into the tiny, cracked tile bathroom and shut the door behind her. She didn't turn on the light. She turned on the sink, letting the water run at full blast to mask any sound. She sank to the cold tile floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and finally let the terror of the last 24 hours take over. She wept. She wept silently, her entire body shaking violently as the phantom echoes of gunfire, the smell of blood, and the terrifying glare of the helicopter spotlights assaulted her mind. She was a mother. She was a soldier. She was a fugitive. After 10 minutes, the tears stopped. The cold, mechanical discipline of Staff Sergeant Hayes returned. Victoria washed her face with freezing water, staring at her shadowy reflection in the mirror. She walked back into the bedroom, retrieved her Sig Sauer P365 from her waistband, and sat in the cheap armchair facing the barricaded door. She laid the gun in her lap, her hand resting on the grip. She didn't sleep a single wink that night. She just sat in the dark, watching the door, waiting for the ghosts to catch up. The first light of dawn didn't bring any warmth to room 114 of the Starlight Motel. It only filtered through the edges of the blackout curtains in a dull, Gray haze, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. Victoria Hayes hadn't slept. She sat perfectly still in the cheap armchair, her Sig Sauer P365 resting on her thigh. Her eyes were bloodshot, tracking the subtle shifts of morning shadows. On the bed, Daniel was curled into a tight ball, his breathing finally steady after a night punctuated by soft whimpers and sudden, panicked gasps. She looked down at the heavy canvas duffel bag sitting by her boots. $500,000. It was a fortune that could buy the world. But right now, it couldn't even buy them a hot breakfast without raising suspicion. A bruised woman paying for pancakes with crisp, sequential $100 bills in a rundown Indiana diner was a red flag large enough to attract every local cop in a 10-mile radius. They needed paper, birth certificates, social security cards, driver's licenses. Without clean identities, the money was just heavy, radioactive paper. Victoria reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out one of the prepaid burner phones Elias, Co-op, Cooper had given her. She powered it on. The cheap LCD screen glowed to life. She opened the contacts list. There was only one entry, saved simply under the letter S. Co-op was a paranoid man, which meant he was a survivor. He knew that if Victoria came to him for a ghost car, she would eventually need ghost papers. She tapped the call button. It rang 4 times before a voice answered, a smooth, heavily accented voice that sounded like crushed velvet and cigarette smoke. "The shop is closed," the voice said calmly. "Co-op said you keep an emergency ledger." Victoria replied, her voice dropping to a low, authoritative register. "I need an expedited checkout. 2 full packages. A mother and a son. I need them to pass a federal background check." Silence stretched over the line. She could hear the faint sound of classical music, Bach's cello suites, playing in the background on the other end. "Co-op is handing out my number to strays now?" the voice mused, devoid of any real irritation. "Expedited full packages require a premium. Sweetheart, we are talking $25,000 apiece. And I need passport photos, clean backgrounds, and 24 hours. Money isn't an issue," Victoria stated flatly, glancing down at the duffel bag. "And I don't have 24 hours. I need them by tonight." "Tonight? You ask for miracles," the man sighed. "Indianapolis. The Circle Center Mall. Food court. Look for the man reading the Wall Street Journal. Bring the cash. Bring the photos. And do not bring any tails. 8 p.m. The line went dead. Victoria crushed the burner phone in her hand, feeling the cheap plastic flex under her grip. She tossed it onto the bed next to Daniel. One step closer. She walked over to the bathroom, turned on the harsh overhead light, and splashed freezing water on her face. She stared at her reflection. She had to transform herself. She grabbed a cheap pair of scissors she had bought at a gas station the night before. With ruthless, clinical precision, she grabbed a handful of her shoulder-length dark hair and began to cut. She chopped it into a short, jagged bob, completely altering the silhouette of her face. She found a box of cheap, dark brown hair dye in her plastic shopping bag and got to work. When she was finished, the exhausted, long-haired EMS driver from the south side of Chicago was gone. Staring back at her was a sharp-featured woman with a dark, severe bob who looked like she could be a tired corporate accountant running from a bad divorce. "Mom?" Daniel was sitting up in bed, rubbing his eyes. He looked at her, his head tilting in confusion. "You look different." "I know, baby. Victoria smiled softly, wiping the dye from her hands. It's part of the invisible game. We're getting new names today. How does that sound? Daniel thought about it for a second, then nodded. Can my new name be Peter? Like Spider-Man? Victoria let out a genuine, breathless laugh, the first one in days. Peter it is. Come on, Pete, let's get packed. We have a drive ahead of us. 200 miles north, in the grimy, oil-stained interior of Elias Cooper's garage, the atmosphere was considerably less optimistic. Special Agent Marcus Thorne stood in the center of the bay. The collar of his trench coat popped against the Chicago wind blowing through the open garage doors. Two armed FBI agents stood by the entrance, their hands resting casually on their tactical belts. Co-op was sitting on a plastic crate, wiping his hands with a red shop rag, looking entirely unimpressed. I run a legitimate business here. Agent Thorne, Co-op grunted, tossing the rag onto a workbench. I fix cars. I don't ask for life stories. You want to see my books? Get a warrant. Thorne didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He slowly walked over to the workbench, his dark eyes scanning the meticulous organization of Coop's tools. I don't need a warrant to look at the dirt on your floor. Mr. Cooper, Thorne said mildly, pointing a gloved finger at the concrete. Mixed with the black motor oil and tire tracks were faint, powdery white footprints. Gypsum dust, Thorne noted, turning to face the massive mechanic. Matches the chemical composition of the drywall from a breached apartment unit on the south side. The footprint size is a women's 7. Standard issue M's tactical boot tread. Coop's jaw tightened, but his eyes remained dead flat. A lot of people wear boots. Fed. But not a lot of people serve in the 101st Airborne with Staff Sergeant Victoria Hayes. Thorne countered, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and tossing it onto the workbench. It was a photo of Co-op and Victoria, taken in Afghanistan, both wearing desert camo, standing next to a Humvee. She saved your leg, Elias. I read the after-action report, Thorne said, his voice softening into a tone of dangerous empathy. I respect loyalty. I truly do. But she is in way over her head. She stole a massive amount of cartel cash. And she's dragging a 7-year-old boy into a crossfire. If you helped her, you are aiding a federal fugitive. I don't know what you're talking about, Co-op said stubbornly, crossing his massive arms. Thorne sighed, a heavy, disappointed sound. He pulled a small digital tablet from his other pocket. We ran the inventory of your lot using drone surveillance footage from 2 days ago. Thorne stated, tapping the screen. You had a silver 2014 Subaru Outback parked in Bay 3. It's gone. You didn't report it stolen. And there's no bill of sale. Co-op stared at the tablet, his pulse ticking faintly in his neck. Thorne had him boxed in. I'm going to find her. Elias, Thorne said, leaning in closer, his dark eyes boring into the mechanic. She is a soldier, which means she follows protocols. She needed a burner car. She came to her motor pool sergeant. She needs IDs. She's going to use your contact. Tell me who you sent her to. Give me the forger, and I walk out of here. Keep quiet, and I tear this garage down to the studs and put you in Leavenworth for obstruction. The silence in the garage was agonizing. Co-op looked at the photo of him and Victoria from Kandahar. He remembered the feeling of his blood soaking into the sand, and the fierce, terrifying determination in Victoria's eyes as she tied the tourniquet, screaming at him to stay awake. He owed her his life. But he had a wife and 3 daughters asleep in a house 10 minutes away. Co-op closed his eyes. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she asked for paper. I gave her a burner. The number belongs to a guy who calls himself Silas. Operates out of Indy. Thorne smiled, a cold, terrifying expression. He tapped his earpiece. Miller, contact the Indianapolis field office. Tell them to scramble a surveillance team. We're looking for a silver 2014 Subaru Outback. And find me everything you have on a local forger named Silas. Thorne turned back to Co-op, buttoning his trench coat. You made the right choice, Mr. Cooper. As Thorne walked out into the biting Chicago wind, the net began to close rapidly around the state of Indiana. Victoria Hayes thought she was driving toward freedom. She didn't know she was driving straight into a federal trap. The Circle Center Mall in downtown Indianapolis was a sensory overload of neon storefronts. The sickeningly sweet smell of cinnamon pretzels. And the echoing roar of 1,000 intersecting conversations. It was 7:45 p.m. Victoria Hayes rode the glass escalator up to the 3rd floor. Her hand resting protectively on Daniel's, no, Peter's, shoulder. She looked like a completely different person. The dark, jagged bob framed her face sharply, hiding the lingering bruises along her jawline. She wore a beige trench coat she'd bought at a thrift store. And a pair of cheap, tortoiseshell reading glasses. Slung across her chest was a nondescript black messenger bag containing $50,000 in banded hundreds and their passport photos. The rest of the cartel cash was safely locked in the trunk of the Subaru, parked 4 blocks away in a dimly lit municipal garage. Stay close to me, Pete, Victoria murmured, her eyes constantly sweeping the balconies, the storefronts, and the open walkways. Don't let go of my coat. It's really loud in here. Mom, he whispered back, tugging at his new baseball cap. I know. Just keep walking. Victoria didn't head straight for the food court on the top level. That was a rookie mistake. Instead, she stopped on the 3rd floor mezzanine, leaning against the glass railing that overlooked the sprawling dining area below. She bought a soft pretzel she had no intention of eating and began to scan the environment. Observation, assessment, execution, the military mantra repeated in her head like a metronome. She spotted Silas almost immediately. He was sitting at a corner table near a closed-down pizza stand. A cup of black coffee in front of him. He was a thin, nervous-looking man in a tweed jacket, holding a copy of the Wall Street Journal perfectly upright. He checked his watch twice in the span of 30 seconds. He was sweating. Victoria's gaze drifted away from the forger and began slicing the pie of the surrounding crowd. She was looking for the tells, people who didn't fit the baseline of a Tuesday night mall crowd. There, by the escalators, a man in his early 30s, wearing a windbreaker, staring intently at a cell phone kiosk but not actually looking at the phones. His posture was rigid, his feet shoulder-width apart, a classic Weaver stance readiness. And there, 2 women sitting at a high-top table, nursing empty smoothie cups. They weren't talking to each other. Their eyes were constantly scanning the crowd in overlapping sectors. One of them subtly reached up to press a finger against her tragus, adjusting a concealed earpiece. The blood drained from Victoria's face, leaving her skin icy cold. Feds. A tactical net had been thrown over the entire food court. There were at least 6 plainclothes agents on the floor, perfectly positioned to collapse on Silas's table the moment the transaction happened. Victoria didn't feel anger toward Co-op. She knew the FBI must have squeezed the mechanic until he broke. Special Agent Thorne was relentless. But understanding the why didn't change the terrifying reality of the now. She had to get out. She turned away from the railing, keeping her head down. Okay, Pete, change of plans. We're going back to the car. But as she took a step toward the down escalator, a chilling sight stopped her dead in her tracks. Stepping off the glass elevator on their floor, flanking the only exit route, was a towering man in a dark trench coat. Special Agent Marcus Thorne. He hadn't just sent a local field team, he had flown in from Chicago. His dark, predatory eyes were already scanning the mezzanine, dismissing the teenagers and the exhausted shoppers, looking for the silhouette of a combat medic. The net wasn't just below her, it was closing in on her level. If she ran, she would draw immediate attention. If she walked, Thorne would spot her within the next 60 seconds. She needed a diversion, a massive, chaotic, uncontrollable diversion. Victoria looked down at the food court below. Hundreds of people eating, talking, completely unaware of the federal sting operation happening in their midst. Then, she looked down at the black messenger bag slung across her chest. $50,000. Pete, Victoria said, kneeling quickly and turning her son to face a storefront window so his back was to the concourse. I'm going to do something crazy. When I say, go, I want you to walk, do not run, straight into the Lego store right there and hide behind the biggest display you can find. Do not come out until I come get you. Understand? Daniel's eyes went wide, but he nodded. The boy had been forged in the fire of the last 3 days. Okay, Mom. Victoria stood up. She unzipped the messenger bag. She pulled out 5 thick stacks of $100 bills. $10,000 in total. She snapped the paper bands holding the stacks together, loosening the crisp currency. She walked to the edge of the glass railing, positioning herself directly above the center of the crowded food court, right between the FBI agent's line of sight. She looked down, took a deep breath, and threw the money into the air. 100,000 pennies worth of $100 bills caught the updraft of the mall's massive HVAC system. For a second, time seemed to stand still as the green paper fluttered like a flock of exotic birds, catching the harsh fluorescent lights. Then, a teenager eating a burger looked up. A $100 bill landed squarely on his tray. Holy shit, the kid screamed, jumping up. It's raining money. The reaction was instantaneous and violently primal. Greed overrode basic human decency in a fraction of a heartbeat. Chairs screeched against the floor tiles. People abandoned their meals, lunging forward. The crowd surged toward the center of the food court. A massive, chaotic wave of grabbing hands, shouting voices, and pushing bodies. Hey, that's mine. Get out of the way. Money. Grab it. The FBI agents were caught completely off guard. The 2 women at the high-top table were instantly swallowed by a mob of teenagers fighting over a cluster of bills. The man by the escalators was shoved violently against a pillar by a father abandoning his stroller to dive for the cash. Control. We have a code for massive civilian disturbance, an agent yelled into his lapel microphone, desperately trying to push through the frenzied crowd without drawing his weapon. Up on the mezzanine, Agent Thorne snapped his head toward the chaos below. His tactical mind instantly recognized the distraction for what it was. It wasn't an accident. It was an egress tactic. Cover the exits. She's on the upper levels. Thorne roared into his comms, sprinting toward the railing. But Victoria was already moving. The moment the money left her hands, she tapped Daniel's shoulder. Go. Daniel slipped into the brightly colored chaos of the Lego store. Victoria didn't follow him immediately. She stripped off the beige trench coat, dropping it over the railing to discard her physical description, revealing the plain gray sweater underneath. She pulled the tortoiseshell glasses off her face and tossed them into a trash can. She was a ghost again. She walked calmly into the Lego store, weaving through the towering plastic displays until she found Daniel crouched behind a life-sized Darth Vader statue. "Let's go, Pete," she whispered, grabbing his hand. Instead of going back out to the main concourse, Victoria guided him toward the back of the store. Looking for the universal sign of retail architecture, the heavy metal door marked employees only. She pushed the crash bar. It opened into a dimly lit, concrete service corridor used for freight deliveries. The heavy door clicked shut behind them, instantly cutting off the roaring sounds of the riot in the food court. "Run," Victoria ordered. They sprinted down the long, echoing hallway, passing towering stacks of cardboard boxes and industrial dumpsters. Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs. She had burned $10,000 and lost her only contact for fake IDs. But she had kept her son out of federal custody. They hit the emergency exit stairwell and took the concrete steps two at a time. Descending rapidly to the ground level, Victoria pushed the final fire door open, setting off a blaring local alarm that echoed uselessly into the cold Indianapolis night. They burst out into the dark, rain-slicked alleyway behind the mall. Victoria didn't stop until they had crossed 3 streets, constantly checking her six, keeping to the shadows. When they finally reached the municipal parking garage, the silver Subaru was waiting exactly where she had left it. She unlocked the car, shoved Daniel into the back seat, and practically dove behind the wheel. The engine roared to life as she pulled out of the garage and merged onto the wet city streets. The distant wail of police sirens began to echo from the direction of the Circle Center Mall. Victoria gripped the steering wheel, her breathing ragged. She had outsmarted Marcus Thorne today, but the victory tasted like ash. She had no clean IDs. The FBI knew she was in Indiana. Her timeline had just shrunk from weeks to hours. She looked at the remaining bundles of cash in the messenger bag. Money couldn't buy them a life anymore, it could only buy them distance. "Where to now, Mom?" Daniel asked softly from the darkness of the backseat. Victoria looked at the highway signs illuminated by her headlights. I-70 West, St. Louis. "We're going off the grid, Pete," Victoria said, her voice hardening into unbreakable steel. "We're going where cameras can't see us." The glowing steel parabola of the Gateway Arch loomed out of the freezing fog like a monument to a world they were leaving behind. Victoria Hayes kept the silver Subaru Outback locked at exactly 2 miles per hour under the speed limit as they crossed the Mississippi River into Missouri. It was 3 a.m. The adrenaline that had fueled her daring escape at the Circle Center Mall had long since metabolized, leaving behind a bone-deep, trembling exhaustion. She reached over and turned off the radio. The endless loop of late-night news and static was only making her headache worse. In the rearview mirror, Daniel, now answering solely to Pete, was fast asleep, his head resting against a makeshift pillow of stolen hotel towels. Going off the grid, Victoria whispered to herself, the words tasting like dry ash in her mouth. To a civilian, going off the grid meant paying cash and turning off a cell phone. To a soldier trained in Sarah tactics, it meant disappearing into a place where the grid had never existed in the first place. She bypassed the glowing exit signs for St. Louis and merged onto Interstate 44. Pushing the Subaru southwest, she drove for another 2 hours, watching the urban sprawl surrender to suburban strip malls, which then dissolved into the sprawling, unbroken darkness of the Mark Twain National Forest. The Ozarks, 1.5 million acres of rugged, densely forested mountains, deep ravines, and limestone caves. It was a place where cell signals died, GPS trackers spun in useless circles, and people went to be forgotten. Victoria waited until she hadn't seen another set of headlights for 20 minutes before she made her move. She killed the Subaru's headlights, relying only on the dim amber glow of the parking lights, and cut the steering wheel hard to the right. The car bounced violently as its tires left the smooth asphalt and hit a rutted gravel logging road. Victoria drove blindly into the tunnel of ancient oak and hickory trees. Branches scraped against the sides of the Subaru like skeletal fingers trying to pull them back. The gravel eventually gave way to a muddy, overgrown 2-track dirt trail. The all-wheel drive system whined in protest, tires spinning in the wet clay. But the vehicle clawed its way higher into the mountainous terrain. After 5 miles of brutal, spine-rattling navigation, the trail abruptly ended in a small, overgrown clearing. Sitting in the center of the clearing, barely visible through the thick fog and choking vines, was a dilapidated, single-room hunting cabin. It had a rusted tin roof and walls made of untreated, graying timber. Victoria cut the engine. The sudden silence of the deep woods was absolute. Heavy and suffocating. There were no sirens here. No hum of traffic. Just the wind howling through the bare branches and the distant hoot of an owl. She drew her Sig Sauer P365 from her waistband, chambered around, and stepped out of the car. The freezing Missouri air bit into her skin through her gray sweater. "Stay in the car, Pete," she murmured through the cracked window. "Lock the doors. Don't open them unless it's me." Victoria approached the cabin with the meticulous, fluid grace of a phantom. She checked the perimeter, her boots making zero sound on the damp pine needles. There were no tire tracks, no fresh footprints, no smell of wood smoke. The heavy padlock on the front door was rusted solid, covered in a thick layer of undisturbed moss. The owners, likely weekend deer hunters from the city, hadn't been here in months. She didn't bother trying to pick the lock. She moved to a side window, wrapped her hand in the sleeve of her sweater, and punched through a small pane of glass near the latch. She reached in, unlocked the rusted sash, and pushed the window up. She climbed inside, sweeping the room with the muzzle of her gun and the dim beam of a small penlight she held in her left hand. The cabin was primitive, a cast-iron wood stove in the center, 2 dusty canvas cots, a rough-hewn wooden table, and shelves lined with expired cans of baked beans and rat droppings. It smelled of decay and isolation. It was perfect. Victoria went back out to the car. She carried Daniel inside, wrapping him in the heavy wool blanket, and laid him on one of the cots. He didn't wake up, his exhaustion finally overpowering his trauma. She made 3 more trips to the Subaru, hauling in the duffel bag of cartel cash, a case of bottled water she had bought in Indiana, and a small first aid kit. She parked the car deeper into the brush, snapping off pine branches to camouflage the shiny silver paint in the windshield. From the air, the vehicle was now completely invisible. Back inside the cabin, the temperature was dropping rapidly. It was near freezing. Victoria looked at the cast iron wood stove. There was chopped wood stacked in the corner. Building a fire was a massive tactical risk. Thermal imaging from a federal drone or even a local park ranger spotting the smoke could compromise them instantly. But hypothermia was a guaranteed killer. Survival dictates compromise, she thought, remembering her instructor at Fort Benning. She carefully arranged a small, teepee-shaped pile of kindling in the very back of the stove. She lit it, feeding it just enough oxygen to create a low, smoldering heat without generating a massive plume of smoke from the chimney. The cast iron began to radiate a faint, life-saving warmth into the tiny room. Victoria sat on the floor, leaning her back against the wooden door. She pulled the heavy duffel bag into her lap, resting her forearms over the canvas. $500,000. Out here, in the heart of the Ozarks. It was completely useless. She couldn't eat it. She couldn't burn it. It was just a monument to the nightmare they were running from. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a spool of high-test fishing line and 3 empty tin cans she had scavenged from the garbage outside Elias Cooper's garage. With exhausted, mechanical precision, Victoria crawled outside and rigged a perimeter tripwire around the clearing, stringing the fishing line ankle-high through the brush and tying the cans together. It was the oldest, most basic early warning system in the military playbook. If anything, man or beast, approached the cabin in the dark, she would hear it. When she returned to the cabin, the fire had settled into a bed of glowing red embers. Daniel was breathing softly, the shivering finally gone from his small frame. Victoria sat back against the door, her gun resting loosely in her right hand. Her eyes were burning, heavy with the weight of 4 days without real sleep. But as she listened to the wind rattling the tin roof, a strange sense of clarity washed over her. They had fallen off the edge of the map. The FBI's facial recognition software, their license plate readers, their cell phone tower triangulations, none of it mattered out here in the dirt and the pines. Special Agent Marcus Thorne was a brilliant hunter in the concrete jungle. But out here, the rules of engagement belonged entirely to Victoria Hayes. She looked at her son, bathed in the dim, orange light of the dying embers. "We're ghosts now, Pete," Victoria whispered into the silence of the cabin. "And nobody hunts ghosts in the dark." She closed her eyes, letting her head rest against the rough wood of the door. And for the first time since the rainstorm in Chicago, she allowed herself to sleep. But out in the pitch-black woods, something shifted. A dry branch snapped, sharp and loud like a gunshot, echoing through the trees. Victoria's eyes snapped open. The gun was up, aimed at the center of the wooden door, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. The tripwire hadn't rung. Whatever was out there knew how to step over it. Victoria didn't breathe. She didn't blink. She sat frozen against the cabin door, the Sig Sauer leveled at chest height, her thumb clicking the safety off with a sound no louder than a heartbeat. The wind continued its low, mournful howl, but the silence following the snap of that branch was different. It was an intentional silence. A predator's silence. In the dim, dying orange glow of the wood stove, she glanced at Daniel. He was still out, his small face buried in the wool blanket. She was grateful for that. If he woke up screaming now, they were compromised. 10 seconds passed. 20. A minute. Then, a voice drifted through the gaps in the graying timber walls. It wasn't the booming, authoritative bark of a federal agent. It was a dry, Rasping whisper, sounding like sandpaper on stone. You missed a strand of line. Soldier. Near the creek bed. Too tight. It hums when the wind hits it. Victoria's blood turned to ice. Whoever was out there hadn't just bypassed her tripwire, he was critiquing it. Step away from the door. Victoria commanded, her voice low and lethal. Hands where I can see them through the window. Now. If I wanted you dead, I'd have tossed a kerosene lamp down that chimney flue before you finished your prayer. The voice replied. A dark shape moved past the shattered window pane. Put the safety back on. Staff Sergeant, you're scaring the boy. Victoria hesitated, her brain racing. He knew her rank, or at least, he recognized the tactical discipline of her setup. She stood up slowly, keeping her back to the wall, and edged toward the window. Standing in the clearing, bathed in the silver-blue moonlight, was a man who looked like he had been carved out of the mountain itself. He wore a heavy, oilskin duster and a wide-brimmed hat. A long, salt and pepper beard reached his chest. Slung casually over his shoulder was an old, well-maintained Winchester rifle. He wasn't reaching for it. He was just standing there, as still as the hickory trees. Who are you? Victoria asked. A man who likes his silence. And you're making a hell of a lot of noise for someone trying to be a ghost. The man said. He gestured toward the brush where the Subaru was hidden. Silver paint reflects the moon. Even under pine boughs. I'll help you mud it over in the morning. If you're still here. Victoria lowered the gun an inch. But her grip didn't loosen. What do you want? To tell you that you're parked on the only access road to a moonshine still 3 miles north. The boys who run it aren't as polite as I am. They see a city car and a woman with a bag full of whatever you're hiding. They won't call the sheriff. They'll just bury you where the moss grows thick. Victoria looked at him, searching for a lie in the deep-set, weary eyes. She didn't find one. This man was a survivalist. A relic of the Ozarks. I'm just passing through, she said. Nobody passes through the Mark Twain forest at 4 a.m. with a bleeding heart and a tactical sidearm. The man countered. He stepped closer, stopping just outside the door. I'm Silas. Not the forger you were looking for in Indy. Just Silas from the ridge. My cabin is half a mile up. I've got a root cellar and a wood stove that doesn't smoke like a signal fire. Why help us? Silas looked at the cabin door. Then back at Victoria. I saw the news on a battery-powered radio. They say you're a killer. But I saw the way you carried that boy inside. A killer don't tuck a child in with his favorite toy before checking the perimeter. I spent 3 tours in the NOM. Staff Sergeant. I know a soldier when I see one. And I know a soldier who's been pushed too far. Victoria felt a lump form in her throat. A sudden, terrifying crack in her armor. She was so tired. The weight of the last few days felt like it was finally going to crush her ribs. The FBI is coming, she whispered. Let him come. Silas said, a grim, toothless smile touching his lips. Federal agents don't like these woods. Their fancy boots get stuck in the clay. And their radios don't work in the hollows. But if you want to keep that boy safe, you need to get off the floor and follow me. Those shiners will be moving their product at dawn. Victoria looked at Daniel, then at the heavy duffel bag of money. She had $500,000. But Silas was offering the only thing money couldn't buy in this wilderness: local knowledge. She opened the door. The cold air rushed in, smelling of damp earth and pine. One wrong move, Silas, and I'll put a round in you, she warned. Understood. Silas nodded, tipping his hat. Now wake the boy. We need to move before the light catches us. Victoria gently shook Daniel awake. He didn't cry this time, he just looked at the old man in the doorway and then at his mother. Is he a ghost too? Mom? Daniel asked sleepily. Victoria looked at Silas, then back at her son. No, Pete, he's a guide. They stepped out into the dark, misty woods. Silas led the way, moving with a silent, eerie fluidity that Victoria, even with her military training, struggled to match. They bypassed her tripwires, Silas pointing them out with a gnarled finger, and began the steep climb up the ridge. As the first faint, bruised light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, Victoria looked back one last time at the small hunting cabin. It looked lonely, a tiny speck of civilization being swallowed by the vast, uncaring wilderness. She felt the weight of the Glock in her waistband and the heavy strap of the money bag on her shoulder. She was deeper into the dark than she had ever been. But as Silas's heavy duster disappeared into the fog ahead of them, Victoria realized that she wasn't just running anymore. She was disappearing. And for a ghost, that was the only way to win. The cabin Silas called home was less of a house and more of a fortress built into the limestone throat of a ridge. It was camouflaged with living ivy and jagged rock, invisible from more than 20 yards away. Inside, the air was dry and smelled of hickory smoke and old leather. Victoria sat by a small, soot-stained window, her Sig Sauer stripped and cleaned on the wooden table in front of her. Daniel was asleep on a pile of deer hides in the corner, finally drifting into a deep, dreamless slumber. Silas stood by a cast-iron stove, stirring a pot of heavy oats. He hadn't spoken since they arrived 2 hours ago. He moved with a rhythmic, economical grace that Victoria recognized, the movements of a man who had spent a lifetime avoiding detection. "You're thinking like a soldier, Staff Sergeant," Silas said, his voice a low rasp without looking up. "You're thinking about fields of fire and extraction points." "It's the only way I know how to think," Victoria replied, reassembling her weapon with a metallic click-clack. "Thorne won't stop. He's not a local cop. He's a hunter. Men like him," Silas spat, "they rely on their toys. They think because they can see the heat of a rabbit from a satellite. They own the woods. But the woods have a way of swallowing light." 3,000 feet above the Mark Twain National Forest, a General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper drone circled in a silent, predatory orbit. In a mobile command center parked at the edge of the forest, Special Agent Marcus Thorne stared at a wall of high-definition monitors. The infrared feed showed a world of cold blues and grays. "We've got a thermal spike," Agent Miller said, pointing to a flickering orange dot on the screen. "Coordinates 37.42 north, 91.23 west. It's small, sir. Could be a campfire. Or a wood stove." Thorne leaned in, his eyes narrowed. "Zoom in. Run the signature against the atmospheric moisture. Is it vented?" "Yes, sir. It's coming from a chimney flue. But it's shielded. Someone knows how to hide a heat signature." Thorne straightened his tie, a grim smile touching his lips. "She's there. Only a combat medic with SARA training would know how to baffle a wood stove like that. And she's not alone. That cabin isn't on the U.S. Geological Survey maps." "Should we send in the local SWAT?" Miller asked. "No," Thorne said firmly. "The Ozarks are a maze. We move in heavy. She'll hear us coming from a mile away and slip through the ravines. We send in a 4-man snatch and grab team. Silent entry. No lights. No sirens. I want her alive. Miller. I want to know who gave her that money. Back on the ridge, the forest suddenly went silent. The crickets stopped their rhythmic chirping. The wind died down to a breathless hush. Victoria stood up, her hand instinctively dropping to her holster. She looked at Silas. The old man was already standing by the door, his Winchester rifle gripped in his gnarled hands. He wasn't looking out the window, he was tilted his head, listening to the earth. The birds, Silas whispered. They lit out from the creek bed 2 minutes ago. Drones? Victoria asked, her heart beginning to hammer. No, boots. Heavy ones. They're coming up the northern slope, Silas said. He looked at Victoria, his eyes hard as flint. The feds are here, girl, and they brought their shadow walkers. Victoria grabbed her messenger bag and knelt by Daniel. Pete, wake up. We have to play the game again. Right now. Daniel sat up, his eyes wide with instant, practiced alertness. He didn't ask questions. He just grabbed his backpack and stood by his mother's side. There's a cave system behind the cellar, Silas said, kicking aside a heavy rug to reveal a trapdoor. It leads out to a dry wash a mile east. I'll hold them at the ridge. Give you time to disappear. I'm not leaving you to die. Silas, Victoria snapped. I'm 80 years old and I've got lung cancer. Staff Sergeant. Silas smiled, a dark, jagged expression. This is the first time I've felt alive since '72. Now get that boy out of here. If you see a blue flare in the sky, it means I've tripped the shiners still. It'll bring every local outlaw to this ridge in 5 minutes. Use the chaos. Run south. Victoria looked at the old warrior. She gave him a sharp, crisp salute, one professional to another. Silas returned it with a slow nod. She lowered Daniel into the dark, damp hole of the cellar. As she followed him down, she heard the first muffled thud of a flashbang grenade exploding in the clearing outside. Then, the roar of Silas's Winchester echoed through the floorboards, a defiant scream against the coming tide. Victoria hit the dirt floor of the cellar, grabbed her son's hand, and dove into the black, jagged mouth of the cave. She didn't look back, she navigated by touch, her fingers skimming the cold, slimy limestone walls, moving deeper into the bowels of the mountain. Above them, the ridge was erupting into a symphony of gunfire and shouting. Victoria Hayes was a ghost again. But this time, she was a ghost with a gun, moving through a tomb of stone. And Marcus Thorne was about to find out that in the dark, the hunter is often the easiest prey. The limestone walls of the cave system felt like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. Slick with condensation and ancient, freezing mud. Victoria Hayes moved with one hand on Daniel's shoulder and the other trailing along the jagged rock, navigating by the dying pulse of Silas's old penlight. Behind them, the muffled boom-boom-boom of Silas's Winchester had been silenced, replaced by the rhythmic, metallic chatter of suppressed submachine guns. The FBI's tactical team was in the house. Stay low, Pete. Don't breathe through your nose. It'll make too much noise, Victoria whispered, her voice barely a vibration in the humid air. Suddenly, a sharp, searing pain exploded in her left shoulder. She didn't hear the shot. The suppressor and the cave's echoes had masked it. Nung ko kam nyan duok suk nong. She stumbled, her knees hitting the wet stone. A ricochet sparked off the wall inches from Daniel's head. Contact. A muffled voice echoed from the tunnel behind them. Target is wounded, moving toward the south egress. Victoria scrambled behind a massive stalagmite, pulling Daniel into the shadows. She reached back, her fingers touching something warm and sticky. Her hand came away dark in the dim light. A graze, maybe deeper. The bullet had torn through the deltoid muscle. "Mommy, you're bleeding," Daniel whimpered, his voice trembling with a terror that no 7-year-old should ever know. "I'm fine, baby. It's just a scratch," she lied, her teeth gritted so hard they felt like they might crack. "I need you to be my lookout. Watch the tunnel we just came from. If you see a light, any light, you squeeze my hand. Okay?" Daniel nodded, his small face set in a mask of grim determination. Victoria reached into her messenger bag. She didn't have a hospital. She had a field kit and a bottle of high-proof moonshine Silas had pressed into her hand before they fled. She bit down on a piece of leather strapping from the bag. With a shaking hand, she poured the alcohol over the wound. The agony was blinding, a white-hot iron pressed into her flesh. She stifled a scream into the leather, her vision swimming with black spots. She needed to debride the wound and pack it, or the trail of blood would lead Thorne's team straight to them. Using a pair of tactical tweezers and a sterilized needle from her kit, she worked in the shadows, her fingers moving by muscle memory developed in the dust of Kandahar. She stitched the jagged tear in her own skin, every pull of the thread a fresh lightning bolt of pain. She packed it with hemostatic gauze and wrapped it tight with a pressure bandage. Focus. Haze. Pain is just information. Process it and move. She looked at her watch. 13 minutes since Silas stayed behind. The tactical team would be using thermal optics, FLIR. In the cold cave, her body heat was a glowing beacon. "Pete, give me your backpack," she whispered. She took the small bag, pulled out a spare emergency thermal blanket, the shiny, crinkly silver kind, and draped it over a large rock 10 yards to their left. She placed a chemical hand warmer inside it. To an infrared scope, it would look exactly like a human torso huddling in the dark. "Now we move, quiet as a heartbeat," she said. They crawled through a narrow squeeze, a gap in the rock barely wide enough for an adult. On the other side, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber where the sound of rushing water echoed. The south egress. But the exit wasn't empty. 2 figures stood silhouetted against the faint moonlight at the cave's mouth. They wore high-cut tactical helmets and quad-eye night vision goggles, GPNVGs. The green glow of their optics made them look like insectoid demons. "Thorne, we're at the south mouth." No sign of. Victoria didn't wait for him to finish. She knew she couldn't outshoot 2 elite agents with a handgun while wounded. But she knew physics. She reached into her bag and pulled out the heavy maglite. She didn't turn it on. Instead, she threw it with a violent overhand arc toward the thermal decoy she'd left behind the rock. The flashlight clattered loudly against the stone. "Movement. 11 o'clock, one of the agents shouted. Both men turned their backs to the exit, their rifle lights cutting through the darkness toward the silver blanket. In that heartbeat of misdirection, Victoria lunged. She didn't use her gun. The muzzle flash would give her away. She used the weight of her body and the darkness. She slammed into the first agent, driving her combat knife into the gap in his body armor, the soft tissue of the thigh. He went down with a muffled cry. The second agent spun around, but Victoria was already low. She swept his legs out from under him, her boots connecting with his shins like iron bars. As he hit the ground, she didn't kill him. She grabbed the flashbang grenade from his tactical vest, pulled the pin, and shoved it under his chest. "Close your eyes, Pete," she roared. Crack boom. The whiteout was absolute. Inside the enclosed cave, the sound was a physical punch to the brain. The agents, their night vision goggles amplifying the light by 1,000 times, were instantly blinded, their retinas likely scorched. Victoria grabbed Daniel and sprinted past the screaming, disoriented men. They burst out of the cave mouth into the freezing Missouri night. The air was sweet, cold, and tasted like freedom, but as she looked down the slope, she saw the headlights of a dozen black SUVs winding up the mountain road. The net wasn't just closing, it was being pulled tight. She looked at the bleeding wound on her shoulder, then at the terrified boy in her arms. "We can't run anymore, Pete," Victoria whispered, her voice cracking. "We had to disappear." She looked toward the rushing river at the bottom of the ravine, the black, churning water of the current river. It was suicide in this weather. But it was the only path the drones couldn't follow. "Hold your breath," she said, clutching him to her chest. And then, Victoria Hayes took the final leap. The current river wasn't water, it was an icy, liquid muscle that tore the breath from Victoria's lungs. The moment they hit the surface, the shock was total. It felt like being shattered by 1,000,000 glass hammers. Victoria's wounded shoulder screamed in protest as she fought the current. One arm locked like a steel shackle around Daniel's waist. They were swept downstream, bobbing like debris in the pitch-black maw of the ravine. "Hold your breath," Victoria gasped, her voice swallowed by the roar of the rapids. The silver moonlight danced on the white foam as they were slammed against submerged logs and jagged limestone outcroppings. Victoria used her body as a shield, taking the brunt of every collision to keep Daniel from being crushed. Her vision began to tunnel. The blood loss, the freezing temperature, and the sheer physical exhaustion were finally dragging her under. Then, the river narrowed, surging through a tight stone throat before spilling into a stagnant, fog-choked basin. Victoria felt her boots touch silt. With a final, agonizing surge of maternal adrenaline, she dragged Daniel onto a muddy bank overgrown with weeping willows. They collapsed into the muck, shivering so violently their teeth sounded like castanets. Pete. Victoria wheezed, crawling over him. Daniel was coughing, spitting out river water, his face a terrifying shade of blue. But he was breathing, he was alive. She didn't have time to celebrate. High above on the ridge, the sky was suddenly illuminated by a searing blue flare. Silas, the old man, had kept his word. He had tripped the alarm for the moonshiners, turning the mountain into a three-way war zone between the FBI, the local outlaws, and whatever shadows were moving in the trees. But as Victoria looked across the basin, she saw something that made her heart stop. Two black Suburbans were idling on a dirt access road not 50 yards away. These weren't FBI vehicles. They were too clean, too expensive. The men stepping out weren't wearing tactical vests. They wore heavy overcoats and carried suppressed submachine guns with professional indifference. The Castellano cleaners. Salvatore Castellano had given his word. But the syndicate didn't leave loose ends. Especially not a woman who knew their private medevac protocols and carried $500,000 of their tax-free revenue. "Movement by the bank," one of the men said, his voice cold and mechanical. He leveled a thermal-sighted weapon toward the willow trees. Victoria reached for her Sig Sauer. It was gone, lost to the river. She was unarmed, wounded, and cornered. FBI, drop the weapon. A sudden, booming command echoed from the trees behind the basin. Special Agent Marcus Thorne stepped out of the fog. He was alone, his suit ruined, his face scratched by briars. He held his service pistol in a rock-steady grip, aimed directly at the lead mob enforcer. "Agent Thorne," the enforcer said, not lowering his weapon, "you're out of your jurisdiction. This is private family business. Walk away, and we'll tell the Bureau you died a hero in the woods." "I don't take career advice from mid-level button men," Thorne snapped. He flicked his gaze toward the mud where Victoria and Daniel lay huddled. He saw the blood soaking through her bandage. He saw the terrified child. In that moment, the hunter saw the human. "Hayes," Thorne said, his voice low but urgent. "The bag, does it have a tracker?" Victoria froze. She looked at the duffel bag, still strapped to her chest. She tore open the top. Deep inside the lining, hidden beneath the stacks of cash, was a small, blinking red LED. Vance. He hadn't just been muscle, he was the insurance policy. The mafia hadn't followed her, they had been guided to her. "Throw the bag toward them," Thorne ordered. "Now." Victoria didn't hesitate. She unslung the heavy bag and hurled it into the center of the dirt road, between Thorne and the enforcers. The lead enforcer looked at the bag, then back at Thorne. A standoff of three powers: the law, the outlaw, and the survivor. "You want the money? Take it," Thorne said, his eyes never leaving the enforcer's scope. "But the woman and the boy stay with me. If you fire a single round, my tactical team, who are currently orbiting 3 minutes out, will turn this basin into a parking lot." It was a bluff. Victoria knew it. Thorne was alone, cut off from his team by the ridge fire. But he stood there with the unshakable confidence of a man who held all the cards. The lead enforcer hesitated. He looked at the bag of $500,000. He looked at the lone FBI agent. "Kill them all," the enforcer whispered. The world erupted. Thorne dove behind a fallen oak, firing 3 rapid shots that shattered the Suburban's windshield. The enforcers opened up, their suppressed weapons spitting lines of lead that shredded the willow trees around Victoria. "Crawl to the rocks. Move," Thorne roared at her. Victoria grabbed Daniel and scrambled through the mud toward the stone outcrop where Thorne was pinned down. Bullets whistled inches above her head, snapping branches and kicking up plumes of dirt. She rolled behind the rock, slamming into Thorne's shoulder. "You're a pain in the ass, Hayes," Thorne grunted, swapping out a fresh magazine without looking at her. "You're late, Agent," Victoria retorted, her combat medic instincts kicking in. She saw a dark stain on Thorne's thigh. "You're hit. Through and through. All live," he said, handing her a spare magazine. "I saw your file. You know how to use a Glock?" Victoria took the mag, her eyes hardening into the stare of the 101st Airborne. "Give me yours and find out." Thorne looked at her, then at the mobsters flanking their position. He pulled a backup Smith & Wesson shield from an ankle holster and pressed it into her hand. "Don't make me regret this, Staff Sergeant. Just keep your head down, Special Agent." Side by side, the hunter and the haunted turned their weapons toward the darkness. The war for the South Side had followed them to the heart of the Ozarks. But the Mafia had forgotten one thing. They were fighting 2 of the best trained soldiers in the world. And they were fighting a mother who had run out of places to hide. The night exploded in a synchronized mechanical roar. The heavy-caliber rounds from the Castellano enforcers chewed through the ancient oak tree shielding Victoria and Thorn, sending jagged splinters of wood flying like shrapnel. Left flank. Movement by the creek. Thorn barked, leaning out to fire a precise double tap that caught a mobster in the shoulder. Victoria didn't hesitate. She rolled from behind the rock, staying low in the freezing muck. Her wounded shoulder was a white-hot scream of agony. But her hands were steady, combat steady. She leveled the Smith & Wesson shield Thorn had given her. Squeeze. Reset. Squeeze. Two enforcers trying to circle their position crumpled into the high grass. Victoria didn't feel like a fugitive anymore. She felt like Staff Sergeant Hayes. She was back in the zone, that cold, peripheral clarity where time slows down and every heartbeat is a tactical decision. "Pete, stay flat. Don't move until I tell you," she shouted over the gunfire. The lead enforcer, realizing his tactical advantage was evaporating, sprinted toward the discarded duffel bag. He reached for the $500,000, but a suppressed round from Thorn's service weapon took him squarely in the chest. He spun backward, his blood spraying over the stacks of uncirculated hundreds. Suddenly, the forest fell into a terrifying, vacuum-like silence. The black Suburbans were riddled with holes, their engines hissing steam into the cold air. The enforcers were down, dead or dying in the Missouri mud. Thorn slumped against the mossy rock, his face ashen. He was clutching his thigh, blood seeping through his fingers. "Is that all of them?" Victoria scanned the treeline, her night vision adjusted to the shadows. Clear, for now. She crawled over to Thorn, her medic instincts overriding everything else. She ripped open his trouser leg with a combat knife. "Hold still. Agent, you're hemorrhaging. That round nicked the femoral." "Save it, Hayes," Thorn wheezed, his eyes fluttering. "My team is 5 minutes out. They'll find you. You can't win this." Victoria ignored him. She pulled a tactical tourniquet from her kit, the last one she had, and cranked it tight above his wound. Thorn groaned, a guttural sound of pure pain, before his head fell back against the stone. "I'm not trying to win, Thorn," Victoria whispered, her hands covered in his blood. "I'm just trying to be a mother." She finished the dressing, checking his pulse. Steady. He would live. Victoria stood up and looked at the duffel bag lying in the mud. Surrounded by bodies, the money that had caused all this death. She looked at Daniel, who was shivering under the willow tree, staring at her with wide, haunted eyes. She walked over to the bag. She didn't take it. Instead, she grabbed a single stack of hundreds, $10,000, and shoved it into her pocket. Then, she pulled a flare from the dead enforcer's vest and tossed it into the open Suburbans. The gasoline ignited with a muffled whoomph. Within seconds, the cars, the money, and the evidence of the cartel's involvement were being consumed by a towering inferno. Victoria walked back to Thorn. He was conscious again, watching her through the haze of pain. "Why?" he asked, gesturing toward the burning money. "Because as long as that money exists, they'll never stop coming for us," Victoria said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small, blinking tracker she had found earlier. She set it on the rock next to Thorn's hand. "Tell your bosses the money burned in the crash. Tell them Victoria Hayes and her son drowned in the Current River." Thorn looked at the tracker, then up at the woman standing before him. He saw the Silver Star recipient. He saw the mother who had jumped into a freezing river for her child. He saw a soldier who had been betrayed by the very system she had bled for. In the distance, the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of FBI transport helicopters began to vibrate through the valley. "Go," Thorne whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "Before I change my mind." Victoria stared at him for a long heartbeat. "Thank you, Marcus." "I never saw you, Staff Sergeant," Thorne said, closing his eyes. "You're just another ghost in the woods." Victoria grabbed Daniel's hand. They didn't run this time. They walked into the deep, dark fog of the Ozarks, moving south toward the border where the forest was thickest. 1 year later, the small coastal town in Oregon smelled of salt spray and Douglas fir. A woman with short, sun-bleached hair sat on a wooden porch, watching a young boy play in the sand with a golden retriever. The boy was laughing, a real, bell-like sound that carried over the crashing waves. He was wearing a new backpack, ready for his first day at the local elementary school. "Peter, time for lunch," the woman called out. "Coming, Mom," the boy shouted, sprinting toward the house. The woman smiled, a slow, peaceful expression that reached her eyes. She picked up the morning newspaper from the porch table. On the back page, a small headline caught her eye: FBI agent Marcus Thorne promoted to Assistant Director of Organized Crime Task Force. Beneath the headline was a quote from Thorne: "The Hayes case remains closed. No bodies were recovered from the river. But in conditions that extreme, survival is a mathematical impossibility. We have moved on." Victoria folded the paper and tucked it under her arm. She felt the weight of the small, simple life she had built, a life without guns, without sirens, and without fear. She looked out at the vast, blue horizon of the Pacific Ocean. The storm was over. The ghosts were finally at rest. Victoria Hayes walked into her house, closing the door softly behind her.